Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 3821, Speaking in the Human Language. After Jeffrey's brief talk with the little monster, he formed a general understanding of the situation in the deep space. The deep space was no longer as glorious as it had been in the past. Although these newly born creatures were fifth-grade creatures, they were not as strong as the cinnabar race and the fostering race. Moreover, most of the creatures were still in an extremely primitive state. Jeffrey had taken note of this in the tests. However, given enough time, any civilization could be capable of building itself slowly from ruins. Over the long years, some races had gained intelligence, established strong social structures, and expanded their territories. The little monster came from a race called the elemental race. The elemental race had not been considered a powerful race at first. In fact, they were quite weak, and had almost been annihilated twice in their history. There were countless minor races like the elemental race that had been wiped out completely. When the elemental race was in crisis, they met a human spirit, Elder Shui, who had been mentioned by Jeffrey. Although Elder Shui was an elder of the Bold Conjecture House and his strength was at the top level in the abstruse energy world, he was weak in the deep space. After all, the power levels in the deep space were different. However, Elder Shui possessed extraordinary wisdom. This was exactly what the members of the elemental race lacked. He had won the trust of the elemental race and joined them. He helped them escape from their original territory, led them as they slowly built up their strength, and taught them the way to enter the Sky Wheel City. Countless years had passed since Elder Shui joined the elemental race. Now, after many generations of learning and growth, they had grown in power. These days, no one in the deep space underestimated the elemental race. From the very beginning, the little monster had been extremely interested in Jeffrey. The reason was simple, he looked exactly like Elder Shui. Since your race has grown so powerful, how did you get caught? Jeffrey asked. Get caught? The little monster thought for a moment, then said, I did it on purpose. The answer surprised Jeffrey. He had been caught by accident, so he thought that the other intelligent creatures here had also suffered the same fate. But as it turned out, that was not the case for everyone. The little monster pointed at the black ape not far away and said, he and I came in out of our own free will. Why? Jeffrey asked. The Sky Wheel City is the strongest and most powerful city. Whoever occupies it will rule the deep space, the little monster replied. In the deep space, there were a total of 6 powerful races like the elemental race. They were constantly in conflict with each other, but none had scored a decisive victory over everyone else. This was why they had turned to the Sky Wheel City. They believed that this city, the legacy left behind by the most powerful fostering race, contained the power to rebuild the deep space. However, ever since the extermination of the fostering race, the relatively intact Sky Wheel City had shifted to a unique mode. It would kill any trespasser, and the only way to enter it was to be caught by the spiders. The creatures that were caught into the Sky Wheel City would then have to take many tests of intelligence. These tests are endless. When will they end? Jeffrey asked. His voice faltered slightly, for he was not fluent in Sanskrit. No one has reached the end yet, the little monster replied. Then, most of the creatures here will die, the little monster said. His black eyes held a determined, grim look. Most of them will die. So a small part can survive. Why? Jeffrey asked. It seemed the Sky Wheel City was enacting a method of selection. If the creatures couldn't pass the intelligence tests, they would die, and only those who passed would survive. Thus, since no one had passed the final test so far, then all the creatures that had entered the Sky Wheel City should have died. The little monster shook his head. You'll soon know. Jeffrey nodded, falling into a pensive silence. He thought that he had gotten very lucky, to have found someone so informative not long after entering the deep space. Not only had the little monster told Jeffrey much that he didn't know, he had even been a source of valuable information regarding Elder Shui. The only drawback was that he was now in a desperate situation. I want to live. I want to get out of the Sky Wheel City alive. I want to return to the chaos. he thought, and vowed that he would find a way out. There was a rustling sound as the spiders moved along. The 3 spiders patiently climbed up the stairs. Jeffrey had long since realized that these spiders were not living creatures, but puppets. They were simply carrying out orders. After they had been climbing the endless stairs for more than 2 hours, a wide exit finally appeared ahead of them. At the exit was a giant sunken square. A huge, thick chimney stood in the center of the square. With a swish, the teeth on the back of the 3 spiders retracted. Jeffrey, the little monster, and the black ape were all free. Jeffrey was quite agile, and he somersaulted off the back of the spider, landing cleanly on the ground. The little monster and the black ape followed suit. The 3 of them looked around. Jeffrey's attention was caught by an enormous box on the ground, outlined by red lines as thick as his arm. Jeffrey raised his foot, about to step forward. The black ape beside him saw what he was doing and his lips spread in a strange smile. However, the little monster jumped up, grabbing his arm. "Don't move forward." Jeffrey paused, struck by how anxious the little monster seemed. Cautiously he asked, "What's wrong?" "Whoever crosses the line on the ground will die," the little monster said. Jeffrey was only 1 step away from the edge of the red box. As soon as the little monster spoke, he immediately took a few steps back. "What? It's so dangerous here." "Follow me," the little monster said. They glanced behind them. The 3 spiders were gone. When they turned back to the box, it began to glow, and 2 green lines had appeared on the ground from the edge of the red box. The little monster waved his hand at Jeffrey and started to walk along a green line. Jeffrey followed carefully. The black ape stayed where he was for a while. Other green lines appeared on the red box, one after another. Each line obviously led to a different direction, and the black ape chose a path different from theirs. Soon the huge square was filled with the green lines. Following behind the little monster, Jeffrey finally arrived at the left edge of the square. Here, there was an oval building. 3 members of the elemental race stood at the entrance of the building. It seemed they had been specifically waiting for the little monster. When they saw Jeffrey, their expressions grew shuttered and wary. One of them asked the little monster about Jeffrey's identity. The little monster explained in a low voice. The 3 members of the elemental race looked at Jeffrey with surprise and uncertainty, but they opened the door of the oval building and welcomed him in. There were another 7 or 8 members of the elemental race in the oval building. Everyone communicated with each other in their own language. After several moments, they fell quiet and positioned themselves on each side of the room, leaving only one of them in the center. The man looked at Jeffrey keenly. With a smile, he asked, "So you are looking for me?" He was not speaking in the intricate language of the elemental race, nor in the difficult speech of Sanskrit. He was speaking in the human language. Chapter 3822, Fate. It had been a while since Jeffrey had left the deleting space. He only used the human language when he talked to Zia. That was why he was stunned when he heard the familiar language. "Pardon me," he said, still reeling from the shock. The man of the elemental race smiled. "I asked if you were looking for me." "So you are Elder Shui?" Jeffrey asked, finally coming back to his senses. The man of the elemental race nodded in confirmation, peering at Jeffrey with continued interest. He had never thought that someone from the main world would come looking for him. He had initially thought that only the members of the Four Spirits sect would have access to the deep space. But all of them could not return to the main world, not to mention the deep space. Elder Shui knew that there were humans in the chaos. But as far as he knew, they had difficulty surviving the main world. Entering the deep space was a different ball game altogether. So when he came to know of an outsider wanting to meet him, he became as excited as Jeffrey was. "Elder Shui, what happened to you? How did you end up like this?" Jeffrey exclaimed. Elder Shui sighed and said, his voice deep and pained. "I did all this for survival." As a creature of the 4th grade world, it was beyond difficult for Elder Shui to survive in the deep space. He had been through a lot in order to keep himself alive in this mysterious and foreign place. First of all, he had to get used to life in the 5th grade world, for everything here was different from the 4th grade world. "I spent a long time here before I got the chance to possess a man of the elemental race. It was because of this that I was able to live," Elder Shui said. But a sudden thought occurred to him. "Are you from the chaos?" he asked suspiciously. Jeffrey nodded in affirmation. "Have you met?" Elder Shui's words petered out. The only member of the human race that Elder Shui knew from the chaos was the Grand Supreme Elderly Lord. "I bet he knows the Grand Supreme Elderly Lord. He wouldn't have been able to get here otherwise," Elder Shui thought. "I've seen Kincaid," Jeffrey answered the unasked question. "What?" Elder Shui exclaimed, but his voice soon began to tremble. Did Master Kincaid wake up? He asked again, excitement dripping off of him. Yes, he has awakened, Jeffrey responded, nodding. He knew Kincaid's true identity and had seen him through the other shore token. He didn't think Kincaid was a great person and that Kincaid was more powerful than his father. That was why he didn't get why Elder Shui was so excited. How did he wake up? Elder Shui pressed on. He was awakened by my father, Jeffrey answered with a shrug. Is that so? Who is your father? Elder Shui asked. My father is Zen Luo. Jeffrey's voice dripped pride. Elder Shui was not interested in humans, which was why he had never heard about Zen. He waved dismissively and said, I've never heard of this person. His reply upset Jeffrey. Kincaid asked me to deliver a message to you. My father absorbed the ancestry-level bloodline, but lost the sword. Kincaid has asked you to look for an item that contains power from the deep space and that only my father can master, Jeffrey said. Elder Shui stood up abruptly at this, his black tail shivering. Your father managed to absorb the ancestry-level bloodline? He asked. Yes, he did, Jeffrey confirmed proudly. He was glad to see Elder Shui's reaction. After all, Zen was his role model, someone he looked up to. Elder Shui walked back and forth, his heart beating faster with every step he took. He made it. The Grand Supreme Elderly Lord had also succeeded. But he was soon lost in thought yet again. After a long while, he asked, who taught you to walk normally in the main world and the deep space? I don't know, maybe these powers come naturally to me, Jeffrey replied, shrugging again. Jeffrey couldn't answer this question, and neither could Zia or Zen. That was why Jeffrey considered it to be his talent. Did your father cultivate grand weapon refining method before your birth? Elder Shui asked again. Yes, Jeffrey replied. Elder Shui looked relieved at this. He smiled and said, your father is indeed amazing. But you have been able to reach this place only because of me. What nonsense are you talking? Jeffrey snapped. Such a shameless old man. Taking credit for something he hasn't even done. He thought angrily. Elder Shui wasn't angry. He used to be famous for his good temper in the Bold Conjecture House. Yes, your father was able to get the grand weapon refining method and managed to absorb the ancestry-level bloodline because of me. You can travel through different worlds because your father has a special physique. So, technically speaking, you were able to get here because of me. Is that clear enough? Elder Shui explained patiently. His words took Jeffrey by surprise. My father learned the grand weapon refining method from you, he said wonderingly. No, that's not what I meant. I gave it to the Grand Supreme Elderly Lord through a certain method, Elder Shui said. I see, Jeffrey nodded. You said that your father lost that sword. How did that happen? Elder Shui asked again. Kincaid had explained everything that had happened in the chaos to Jeffrey in detail. Jeffrey hadn't understood what he had said, but he filled Elder Shui in on what he was told without missing any details. When he heard that the humanoid creature had gotten his hands on that sword, Elder Shui's eyebrows furrowed, a troubled expression taking its place on his face. He had been in the deep space for a long time, and had uncovered all the secrets of the deep space that the people of the Four Spirits sect had failed to figure out. That was how he was aware of the terrible thing that would happen since the humanoid creature had now obtained that sword. Kincaid told me that the most important thing is to get the other item. Do you know what he was talking about, Elder Shui? Jeffrey asked. Elder Shui walked past Jeffrey and approached the entrance of the oval-shaped building. The thing that Master Kincaid asked you to look for is over there. I have been thinking about how to get it all these years, Elder Shui said, pointing at the huge chimney in the distance. You've been here for so long and you haven't got your hands on it? Jeffrey said, his lips pursing in disapproval. Elder Shui didn't know how to respond to this question. He shook his head helplessly and said, anyone who gets that item would be able to rule the deep space. Do you think it would be easy to acquire it? Look at this place. He pointed at the several oval-shaped buildings in the distance. There are also members of other races of the deep space in these buildings. They arrived here with the same purpose as us, and that is to obtain that thing. For countless years, the 6 races of the deep space sent countless people here. None of them made it out of there alive, he explained. Stop bluffing. It's not that difficult. Those people died there just because they were not intelligent enough. Send me in. I can make it, Jeffrey said confidently, a tinge of arrogance lacing his tone. Elder Shui stared at Jeffrey. What a cocky guy. He has no idea what he is up against. But it suddenly occurred to Elder Shui that Jeffrey was different from others. Perhaps he can do it. Is this fate? I gave his father the grand weapon refining method although we were in different worlds back then, and now he is here, right before my eyes. Maybe, Elder Shui said calmly. You can give it a shot. But if you fail, you will meet your death. Chapter 3823, Life and Death. Jeffrey was initially brimming with confidence, but at the sound of the word, death, his face paled. What's the probability of death? Jeffrey asked in a small voice. Elder Shui tilted his head and thought for a moment. Excluding the people who died long before, about 2 million people have entered the chimney, but no one has succeeded. He paused for a moment. If you want me to give you a probability, then the probability is 0. All of them died. Jeffrey's voice trembled. Yes, they were the elites selected by the 6 great races. They were the smartest, Elder Shui added. Jeffrey fell silent. He and Zen grew up differently. He had grown up in a relaxed, privileged environment, whereas Zen had faced many challenges. Although he had met some minor setbacks in the past, Jeffrey had never truly dealt with a life and death situation before. When he heard the severe consequence, his heart was seized by fear. Elder Shui said this to see how Jeffrey would react. He continued, "Your father has lost the sword to that humanoid creature. Do you know what we are about to go up against? An undefeatable opponent," Jeffrey answered. "It's not that we can't defeat him, but that we will all die," Elder Shui said seriously. Hearing this, Jeffrey was even more flustered. After thinking for a moment, he asked, "What about my father? And my mother? Everything will be downgraded and destroyed, your parents included," Elder Shui said gravely. Jeffrey grew even more frantic. "I need to go back. I need to go back to my parents." Since he knew that there was not much time left, he wanted to escape now and be with his loved ones. He left them quite a long time ago. He'd be lying if he said he didn't miss them. After all, he'd only left because he thought this'd make for an interesting journey. The things he'd encountered along the way made him realize the seriousness of the matter, which changed his carefree attitude. In fact, when Kincaid talked with Jeffrey, he made everything very clear. At the time, Jeffrey learned he had a very important role to play. However, Kincaid didn't want to pressure Jeffrey too much, so he only mentioned that the task at hand was important. He didn't say that eventually, all people would have to die. Elder Shui, on the other hand, was very blunt. He spared no time in telling him that he would lose his life. "Even if you go back, you will still die. Do you have the stomach to watch your parents die like this?" Elder Shui asked, not in a harsh tone. He had lived so long that he could read people's minds. Although he had just met Jeffrey, he had already figured out his personality. Jeffrey was proud, conceited, and couldn't get his mind off play. He didn't have a sense of responsibility, but he was smart and was extraordinarily talented. Elder Shui needed his talent, which was why he went straight to the point. "Then, what else can I do?" Jeffrey shouted in frustration. Elder Shui gently placed his claw on Jeffrey's shoulder. "Of course, there is a way." He pointed at the chimney with his other claw and said, "Your father has the ancestry-level bloodline, but he needs another thing. Only when he gets this thing can he change the situation. This is the only chance. But if I fail, I will die." Jeffrey's voice shook, his eyes brimming with tears. Like all young men, he had a dream of saving the world and becoming a great hero, but he never expected he'd have to go through such lengths to realize this dream. "If you fail, you will die. If you succeed, you can live." Elder Shui snapped. For anyone else, the treacherous beings and eternal realm warriors who had lived in the chaos for countless years, they would have immediately seen the gravity of the situation and would have been ready to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Eastern Emperor Tai, the snake goddess, Zia, the bird masters, and the human spirits all would have cooperated quickly. But Jeffrey didn't. "I refuse. I want to go back. Send me back to the chaos. I want to see my parents." Jeffrey whined, burying his face in his hands. "You can't go back. You can't even go out of this square. Look at the line under your feet. The second you take a step forward, you will die," Elder Shui exclaimed, pointing a claw at Jeffrey's feet. The square was a forbidden area full of killing intent, and all the creatures could only stay within a certain area to survive. Whoosh! Jeffrey abruptly took a few steps back and slammed into the wall behind him. He stared at the line in horror, as if staring at the face of the god of death. "This house can only accommodate 10 people. If there are 11 people in it, everyone will die. So today, one person has to enter the chimney. Are you willing to be this person?" Elder Shui locked eyes with him fiercely. "No, I won't go," Jeffrey wailed. He was overwhelmed with despair. "If no one goes, we will all die together. Do you want that to happen?" Elder Shui pressed him further. "I won't go." Jeffrey continued to resist. Elder Shui smiled ruefully. Ignoring Jeffrey's wails, he turned around and gestured towards the others. All of these members of the elemental race were trained by Elder Shui. Like the little monster before, they had no intention of leaving alive since they entered this place and were willing to sacrifice their lives for their own race. One of them stepped forward and stood before the green lines. Elder Shui then said to Jeffrey, "There are supposed to be only 10 people here." He pointed at the figure standing before the green lines. "But because of you, he has to die. Although he is a non-human creature, he also has parents, brothers, and is unwilling to leave this world. However, for the sake of the entire elemental race, he is willing to sacrifice himself." Jeffrey feebly watched as the member of the elemental race walked along the 2 crooked green lines towards the center of the huge square, until he disappeared within the chimney. A green light appeared on the side of the chimney. It climbed up, bit by bit, along the chimney. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. When the green light came to 1/3 of the chimney, it suddenly disappeared and was replaced by a red light. Elder Shui closed his eyes. With a pained expression, he said regretfully, "He's dead." Jeffrey stared at the chimney in a daze. After a while, he finally reacted. "So soon?" "Yes." Elder Shui nodded gravely. The other members of the elemental race stood up and put their fists on their chests in silence. They had witnessed this scene so many times before, but they could never get used to it. Their hearts overflowed with sadness, although they stood in silence. "If that thing is so difficult to get, why do you even try?" Jeffrey asked huffily. "The same reason as yours. If we don't get it, and it's obtained by other races, the elemental race will perish." Elder Shui shrugged. The gaps between races could not be closed, and the law of the jungle was absolutely in control of everything here. After saying that, Elder Shui turned around abruptly and entered the oval building. From the moment he saw Jeffrey, Elder Shui knew that his chance had finally come. He had waited here for so long, but in the end, the elemental race was unable to produce a member talented enough for the task. However, now the deep space had sent Jeffrey here. He deliberately put a lot of pressure on Jeffrey. Only in this way could he trigger Jeffrey's sense of responsibility. Now that he had given Jeffrey enough pressure, the rest was up to Jeffrey himself. Chapter 3824, Face It Head On. Jeffrey leaned against the wall and stared blankly at the chimney in the distance. The incredible and fascinating adventure was over. Perhaps now he would have to face the god of death. He wasn't prepared for that. His mother had told him all sorts of legends of his father since he was a child. He had saved the Cloud Hall, the Central Region, the Great World and the universe. His father had always been quite fortunate. It all seemed effortless for him, as if all these feats were accomplished with ease. Although Letitia had told him of times his father had been trapped in danger and how he had been on the verge of death on countless occasions, what he heard was a stark contrast to what he had experienced himself. How could he overcome a dead end that no one else had managed to? His father must have been faced with similar predicaments in his time. What would he have done? What was he thinking in these situations? Jeffrey sat there, still, for a few hours. It was getting dark. The golden ring atop the deep space seemed to be covered with a layer of scales, gradually turning from golden to a deep black. As night fell, the slightly bright light shone on the chimney. From afar, it appeared almost as a giant beast, ready to devour the people. Inside the oval building, Elder Shui spoke in the language of the elemental race. The creatures in the deep space communicated with very unique sounds. Unlike the rhythmic sounds of the creatures of the main world, they let out faint squeaks and crackles, like a group of crickets chirping in a low voice. Elder Shui was teaching the elemental race. They still needed to acquire more knowledge in order to successfully handle the test in the chimney. These members of the elemental race were clear about what lay ahead for them. They knew that if they wanted any chance of passing the test, they would have to absorb as much information that might be useful as they could. Their race used to be quite primitive. They were once unable to pass even the initial tests, let alone occupy a place in this huge square. The golden light annihilated them when they had been captured by the spiders and brought to the underground space. As the night stretched on, the black scales on the golden ring became thicker and thicker, and all other surroundings turned pitch black. Elder Shui reached out and gently scratched the wall. A circular flame slowly appeared, revealing those inside and outside the room. Jeffrey then stood up and walked in. "Have you decided?" Elder Shui asked casually. "Why would such a chimney appear here? Why do they need to select an intelligent creature?" asked Jeffrey. "Good question," replied Elder Shui with pride. "Although the fostering race was destroyed, before their elimination, they concocted this. It's really quite something to behold. The cinnabar race and the fostering race had perished together and had left this precious inheritance before their demise in order to select an intelligent creature to resurrect the civilization of the deep space. It was a generous and kind race that cared for the well-beings of others. They might not have existed anymore, but they hoped the civilization of the deep space would be passed on and continue in some way. Jeffrey exhaled heavily upon hearing Elder Shui's words and said, "I've made up my mind. I'll go. Can you teach me what I need to do?" His decision did not surprise Elder Shui, as it was almost inevitable that he would make this choice. "Do not worry," Elder Shui said, patting on the ground beside him as a gesture for Jeffrey to sit down. He then pointed at the chimney and said, "Something has puzzled me all these years. If the fostering race wished to select a successor, why would they arrange such a difficult test which is so difficult that no one could pass it? Why would they?" Jeffrey was just as puzzled. "It is because rebuilding the deep space is not something any ordinary creature of the deep space can do. Most of the world has collapsed and is filled with the fourth grade space." Elder Shui spoke with an air of wisdom beyond most. "They need to choose a being capable of controlling it. Those of the elemental race can only use the ability of energy condensation extreme form. This is not enough for what they require. Other creatures of the deep space face a similar issue." Jeffrey blinked his eyes as he began to realize something. "But I don't have any ability at all." Jeffrey only possessed the godly way power of the chaos. This was not even that useful in the third grade world, not to mention in the fifth grade and fourth grade worlds. "You have the ability to travel through multiple worlds," Elder Shui said with a mischievous grin. "Your ability to travel through different worlds is magnificent." "Elder Shui, do you mean the space in the chimney is a higher level world?" Jeffrey's eyes lit up. "I do not know," answered Elder Shui. Jeffrey did not understand how that was possible. "Elder Shui, you've said you have been in the deep space for a long time. Do you really not know? I have never entered the chimney myself and no living being has returned alive after going in. All I can do is to study the information left behind by the fostering race. What I am sure of is that the test is very special and related to intelligence, ability and vision. But I do not know the exact content of the test," answered the Elder Shui, shaking his head in disappointment. "So you do not intend to enter it on your own?" Jeffrey pressed. Elder Shui acted as a teacher to the elemental race, and it did not make sense that he did not know what was in the chimney considering he taught them about it. "Of course I want to," he responded frankly. "It was by mere coincidence that I merged with this body of a member of the elemental race. I did not have the opportunity to fuse with the second body. Once I am dead, there would be no hope left, and so I have been hesitant and waiting patiently. But I had not expected to see you here," Elder Shui announced joyfully. "So this time, I will go with you. You still have a physical body on the outside. But if I die, I'm dead for good," Jeffrey pointed out. He still felt it was unfair. Elder Shui smiled faintly. "How about I let another physical body commit suicide, right now?" He had not been afraid of death for a long time, and now through Jeffrey, he understood the situation of the Four Spirits sect better. It was inevitable that he risked everything. Jeffrey was taken aback by his determination. He suddenly felt that he shouldn't care too much for narrow personal gains and losses. "When will we make our way in?" Jeffrey asked. "We will wait for the right opportunity," replied Elder Shui. Over the next 3 days, Elder Shui imparted his knowledge to Jeffrey. Although Elder Shui had only deduced the information and experiences, they had been tested by the members of the elemental race one by one, through practice. These people were only able to rise 5 feet in the chimney when he had first led them here. Now, even the weakest of performers could climb 70 to 80 feet high. And the most outstanding of them could make it all the way up to 160 feet. This proved that what Elder Shui knew was valuable and effective. Jeffrey understood the gravity of their undertaking and had listened intently to Elder Shui's introduction the last few days. 3 days later, some of the deep space races appeared on the huge square. They walked along the green lines and headed straight towards the giant chimney. Chapter 3825, Setting Off. Upon seeing the races of the deep space, Jeffrey asked, "Should we be going too?" Elder Shui walked out of the oval building and looked up at the sky. "It's not the right time yet. But they've all sallied forth," said Jeffrey. Elder Shui shook his head. "Today is the power-boosting day, so the innate skills of those races native to the deep space will soar. It's indeed a good day for them, but not for us." In the past few days, Jeffrey had learned much about the races living inside the deep space. He knew that a portion of their power came from the annular sun above their heads, and the light it released today was indeed very dazzling. "What about them?" Jeffrey looked at the members of the elemental race. "They'll naturally go too," said Elder Shui. He then selected 4 members of the elemental race. These guys had long prepared themselves thoroughly, so when Elder Shui chose them, they quickly gathered in front of the door, ready to set off. After Elder Shui gave them a few words of advice, they stepped on the green lines and headed straight for the chimney. Actually, they don't have to go, said Jeffrey as he gazed at their receding backs. You're surprisingly quite kind-hearted, Elder Shui said with a smile. Don't worry, I've taught them a new method. If the method succeeds, they'll be able to go even farther inside the chimney. But they'll die, Jeffrey murmured. After staying here for a few days, he found that the members of the elemental race weren't as hateful as they looked. Furthermore, they had learned the language of the 4th grade world from Elder Shui, so they could have simple conversations with Jeffrey. Now that he had a better understanding of them, Jeffrey couldn't help but feel very sad to watch them heading to their deaths. Elder Shui remained unconcerned. His gaze was fixated at the chimney in the distance as he wanted to observe the movements of the other races in the deep space. Beams of green light began to rise from the surface of the chimney. Some went out after they rose about 40 feet, some were extinguished after they rose about 80 feet, and some others rose all the way to a height of more than 100 feet, an excellent record, and it would have been even more excellent if it wasn't obtained at the cost of those creatures' lives. There are many surprises this time. The Rona race did a good job, and the Cold Ape race is unexpectedly weak. Anyway, it's our turn now. Elder Shui, who had been keeping an eye on the results, said. He considered each result important and always analyzed them. Through thousands of trials and errors, he had managed to roughly figure out some of the techniques to be used in the chimney. When the 4 members of the elemental race entered the chimney, they could see 4 new beams of green light slowly rising up. The speed at which the 4 members climbed up was very slow, and they even stopped for a brief moment sometimes. In the end, however, they kept going up. The first beam was extinguished when it reached 100 feet high. As Elder Shui saw this, the corner of his eyes twitched slightly, and his black claws were clenched into fists. The second beam didn't die out until it reached 130 feet high. This time, Elder Shui's expression looked a little better. When the third beam climbed up to 160 feet high, the members of the elemental race in the oval building let out a cheer. This was their previous record, and it seemed that they could climb up ever farther today. Excitement was also etched on Elder Shui's face. His judgment was right. 160 feet, 170 feet, 180 feet. The higher the green light beams rose, the louder the shouts of the members of the elemental race became. Expectations started to grow in their hearts. They hoped that the 2 clansmen could reach the top of the chimney and get the thing left by the fostering race to end this nightmare-like exploration. To their disappointment, however, one beam suddenly dispersed at the height of 200 feet. The light is off. We still have one person left. He's still rising. The members of the elemental race placed their hopes on the last beam. But it also stopped at the height of 200 feet and then went out. The elemental race fell into silence. Although this result was within their expectation and they were also used to this process, disappointment still crept into their hearts. They failed again. Elder Shui stood there like a sculpture, staring at the chimney in silence. Every time the elemental race failed, he always stood there for a long time to analyze the reason. After a long time, he suddenly turned around and said, "Next time, Jeffrey and I will go in." Upon hearing his announcement, the remaining 4 members of the elemental race changed their expressions greatly. Elder Shui, how can you go in? You're more important than even the leader of our race. You mustn't go in. Our lives are of little value. We still have many members who are willing to sacrifice themselves. You, on the other hand, have only one body. You'll die if you fail. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that the elemental race held Elder Shui in much higher regard than they held their own leader in. Elder Shui wasn't very strong. Any strong member of the elemental race could kill him easily. But the elemental race could reach this point because of Elder Shui. It was Elder Shui who discovered their talents. It could be imagined how important he was for the elemental race. Did the young man ask you to do that? Elder Shui, you mustn't listen to him. I'll throw him out now. A member of the elemental race glared at Jeffrey. Jeffrey couldn't understand the language of the elemental race, so he was naturally baffled by the sudden death glares they shot at him. Why did they hate him all of a sudden? A faint smile appeared on Elder Shui's face. No, he didn't. Then why? You only planned to go in by yourself after he came here, it must be because of him. That certain member continued aggressively. It's because of the information he brought, an important one at that, Elder Shui explained. If we don't get that thing as soon as possible, the deep space will soon be completely downgraded, and you'll all disappear during the downgrading process. What? No way, I don't believe it. The members of the elemental race shook their heads in denial. Although the deep space had shattered, it was still stable and didn't experience any further downgrading. Faced with their refusal to believe this fact, Elder Shui remained calm and patient. He was indeed used to their stubbornness. After all, he was the one who had been educating them, which really wasn't an easy thing to do. In the end, he roughly explained the reason why the deep space collapsed, the current situation, and what had happened in the 3rd grade and the 4th grade worlds. The members of the elemental race were confused, but they roughly understood what had happened. The person, who had caused the deep space to fall into such a situation, was currently making trouble in the 3rd grade world. Once he succeeded, the 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade worlds would collapse. Only by obtaining that object would they be able to save the world. So, I have no choice, said Elder Shui. I'll go in with Jeffrey on the rippling water day 5 days later. What about us? A member of the elemental race asked. You can come with us, but you'd better leave one person behind, said Elder Shui. That person could later replace him and continue to fight for the slim chance. The members of the elemental race no longer objected, but they were now arguing over who should be left behind. All of them were more than willing to sacrifice themselves. Now that they had reached this step, no one was willing to be left behind. After a discussion, the one who came with Jeffrey was finally chosen to stay behind. 5 days later, the rippling water day came. The surface of the annular sun in the deep space emitted a ripple-like golden light, and the sunlight became soft and warm. The warm golden light put all the races in the deep space at ease. Jeffrey, Elder Shui, and 3 members of the elemental race finally set off towards the chimney. Chapter 3826, Reading Ability. The green lines on the huge square zigzagged, like a huge rune array. Jeffrey cautiously followed Elder Shui on the path as wide as his shoulders. If he so much as crossed this green line, he'd instantly die. Jeffrey took every step with care, vigilantly eyeing the green lines before him. The chimney was located in the center of the huge square. It was roughly around 10,000 feet away, but because of the zigzagging path, it was as though they'd walked hundreds of thousands of feet. The other races also sent out their representatives at the same time, so there were more than 10 people walking on the huge square. Sometimes, when they got close to each other, Jeffrey could feel a hint of hostility in their eyes. After all, this was a competition of sorts. It was only natural that the 6 great races were hostile to each other. It was just because of the special nature of the region that they were not allowed to fight each other head-on. 10 minutes later, Jeffrey and his group finally arrived at the foot of the chimney. Although Elder Shui had been here for countless years, it was the first time for him to observe the chimney up close. From afar, the chimney looked like a looming black monster, but now as he observed it closely, he saw it differently. Squinting, he realized the chimney was made of pure black metal, glistening under the sun. Elder Shui walked towards the outer wall of the chimney and pressed his hand against it gently. He had been thinking about the mysteries of the chimney for so long. Now that he was finally in front of it, he had mixed feelings. Just then, he heard someone chuckling from behind him. 3 black apes approached from another path. The black ape in the lead said with a smile, "The elemental race is usually so cautious, but they sent 5 people this time. 4 members of their race already died a few days ago. So, is it only Elder Shui remaining in their camp now? There is a human spirit among them. Is he the helper that Elder Shui found? Last time, one of us saw this human spirit." These black apes who were talking amongst themselves were from the cold ape race. Among the 6 great races in the deep space, the elemental race was the weakest. The only reason why they were able to rise to prominence was that Elder Shui had taken action before the intelligence of other 5 races was fully developed. And that was also the reason why the other races had always looked down upon the elemental race. In the past, several races had sent killers to assassinate Elder Shui, but the members of the elemental race had risked their lives to protect him. Elder Shui doesn't stay in the camp. I'm Elder Shui, replied Elder Shui calmly. The 3 cold apes were obviously stunned for a moment, and the one in the lead showed a puzzled expression. Everyone knows that you are the greatest help to the elemental race, he said slowly. Why are you risking your life today? Have you found a way to crack the levitation tower? Elder Shui wasn't surprised at their reaction. It was a well-known fact that he was extremely important to the elemental race, so it didn't make sense for him to go out in the field like this. The elemental race would do everything in their power to protect Elder Shui, even at the cost of their leader's life. No, answered Elder Shui honestly. Then why do you come here? The cold ape asked, his confusion intensifying. Once they entered the huge square, there was no turning around. Elder Shui would definitely not be able to make it back. Elder Shui just smiled and ignored the cold ape's question. Just then, another race came in from the other side of the chimney. It was the Rona race. The cold ape race and the Rona race were allies. They had always been on good terms. Seeing their allies enter the chimney, the cold ape immediately announced, "Look, Elder Shui of the elemental race has come personally." This was indeed no small matter. The elemental race had always been ahead of the other 5 races on the chimney, and that was all thanks to Elder Shui. The other 5 races had all pressured the elemental race, offering them gifts and benefits in the hopes that Elder Shui would help them. But in the end, he had refused all of them. Thus, the other 5 races decided to join forces against the elemental race. Only then were they able to force Elder Shui to share some information with them. "Elder Shui, are you sure you will be able to pass the levitation tower? Entering the tower rashly is a suicide mission. Aren't you afraid of death?" The several members of the Rona race were stunned. They had the same idea as the cold ape race. Since Elder Shui dared to come in person, this must have meant he had come up with a solution. 2 of the members of the Rona race glared at Elder Shui murderously. Naturally, they didn't want him to succeed. However, the fostering race had imposed powerful restrictions on the whole square, and no one was able to break these rules. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't stop the elemental race. As the members of the Rona race stared at the elemental race with puzzlement and worry, the other 3 races arrived, one after the other. Every time the rippling water day came, the 6 great races would scramble to enter the chimney. But today, they entered calmly, seemingly in no rush. Everyone wanted to see what Elder Shui was going to do. Paying no attention to them, Elder Shui said to his group, "Let's go." The 3 members of the elemental race took the lead in entering the gate to the chimney, followed by Elder Shui and Jeffrey. The door at the foot of the chimney was only as tall as a person. When the 5 of them approached, it automatically began to shrink. Upon entering the gate, Jeffrey took a glance at his surroundings. He found that the interior of the chimney was an extremely wide, metal hall. The floor and walls of the hall were all made of black metal, similar to the chimney's exterior. On the surface of the metal were countless engraved golden rings. Some of the rings were independent of each other, while some were connected to each other. Overall, it looked like a haphazard mess. "What are these rings?" Jeffrey asked, pointing at the golden rings. "Ring patterns," Elder Shui answered immediately. "It's exactly what I thought. At the bottom of the chimney, there are the ring patterns left behind by the fostering race. Anyway, we're not in a hurry to go up. Wait for me to decipher them." The ring patterns were actually the written words of the fostering race and the cinnabar race. The creatures of the chaos were very interested in Sanskrit words. Masters like the Wing King and the primeval Lord of Heaven had spent their entire lives deciphering Sanskrit words. The 4 spirits sect in the main world, on the other hand, were addicted to ring patterns. Kincaid, Xian, and Cornelius each had great attainments in the ring patterns. Elder Shui's attainments in the ring patterns were not as great as theirs in the past, but by now, he not only stayed in the deep space for a long time, but also had the body of the elemental race. His attainments in the ring patterns far surpassed those of anyone else in the 4-spirit sect. After saying that, Elder Shui gently leaned against the wall and began deciphering the ring patterns. "The levitation tower is the root of our race," he deciphered slowly. "It is." The structure of the ring patterns might have been very simple, but it was difficult to decipher them one by one. After all, they were connected to each other, and the line space was quite narrow, so it was difficult to read them. Even if Elder Shui had stayed in the deep space for a long time, it was still difficult even for him to decipher them. "It is also an opportunity for us to start all over again. After we were defeated by the cinnabar race, we took it as fate dictated by Nirvana. Everyone who enters the tower comes for this opportunity," Jeffrey read aloud. Elder Shui froze. Turning around abruptly, he stared at Jeffrey in disbelief. Embarrassed, Jeffrey rubbed his hands shyly. I seem to be able to read these words." Chapter 3827, Answer honestly. Jeffrey didn't find any difficulty in reading the Sanskrit words. It seemed that he had an inherent talent in deciphering them and seeing the hidden information within them. When he first saw these rings, he wasn't able to clearly read the contents. However, right after Elder Shui read a few words according to the ring patterns suddenly became comprehensible before his eyes. It was as if he had already used these words for many years, so he could easily read them like it was his native tongue. "You can really read them?" Elder Shui asked as he was surprised. Just to make sure, Jeffrey shifted his gaze to the other ring patterns, scanned them a few more times and then nodded. "Yes, I can understand them." "That's fascinating. How did that happen? Elder Shui was speechless in surprise for a moment. It's a little difficult for me to decipher these ring patterns, and sometimes the translation is not accurate. Please help me decipher them. Jeffrey had always wanted to be of help if it was within his ability. Thus, with Elder Shui's strong request, he immediately agreed and began reading the ring patterns. The levitation tower is 500 feet high. If one is able to climb the uppermost area of the tower, then they could become its master and would be qualified to obtain the heavenly ring staff, the sacred object of the fostering race. The heavenly ring staff is the foundation of the fostering race. It can freely control all forms of energy. This item is very important, and couldn't just fall into the hands of anyone. Only the one who is the most powerful and worthy can attain it. If one desires to get it, then they need to pass the tests of the levitation tower first. While Jeffrey was reading these words, Elder Shui's eyes lit up. He always knew that the fostering race had some treasure or weapon that matched the heavy sword, but he had no idea what exactly was it. However, through Jeffrey, he had learned what it was and even heard its true name, the heavenly ring staff. Elder Shui refrained from interrupting Jeffrey as he read the ring patterns, and he listened intently to every word that was said. The three members of the elemental race just stayed quietly at the side since they weren't in a hurry. The elemental race and the other deep space races found the ring patterns of no use. Since the fostering race and the cinnabar race had long been gone and had been destroyed for so many years, the 6 large deep space races that appeared afterward were still in a savage stage. Even though they had the strength, they didn't bother creating their own civilization, and their attainment in the ring patterns was close to none. At the same time, the members of the 5 large deep space races outside the levitation tower were even more baffled. Normally, after they entered the levitation tower, all of the creatures' instinct was to rush to the top at their fastest speed. No one would dawdle and stay on the first floor. Outside the tower, most of the creatures saw the 5 rays of green light coming from the elemental race staying on the first floor. They were confused about what they were trying to do there. The fostering race has obtained the inheritance of the world of no limits, and we are the rightful ruler of the stellar world. Since the very beginning, we have treated the cinnabar race as our enemy. On the 10,000th rippling water day, our race managed to slaughter 3,000 masters of the cinnabar race. On the 90,000th scorching fire day, we broke through 13 of their lands, and at the beginning of the ring patterns, the foster race briefly introduced the levitation tower. However, the latter parts seem to only contain a detailed record of the past battles between the fostering race and the cinnabar race. Jeffrey agreed to read the ring patterns in hopes that he could find some clues on the first floor in order to pass through the levitation tower, but those clues were nowhere to be found on them. Instead, for the most part, they were comprised of the history of the fostering race's development. Naturally, Jeffrey got bored while reading them. He suddenly stopped in the middle of a text and asked, "Elder Shui, do I still need to continue reading this part?" "Yes, of course. This is important." Elder Shui was so engrossed in the history of the fostering race. As an elder of the Bold Conjecture House, he felt like it was his obligation to explore the world. Thus, if this kind of information was right before his eyes, how could he miss such a very rare opportunity? Upon hearing Elder Shui's response, Jeffrey couldn't help rolling his eyes and continued reading. From the 10,000th to the 3 trillionth rippling water day, the fostering race had gone through prosperity, rise, conquest, and decline. With their fierce war against the cinnabar race, both of them perished together in the end. After deciphering and reading the last ring pattern, Elder Shui patted Jeffrey on his shoulder with a look of extreme satisfaction. "Now, let's go up." The inner part of the levitation tower was spiral in structure. As they climbed up 10 feet along the spiral staircase, a red line suddenly appeared under their feet and blocked their way. Upon seeing this, they immediately stopped and put their guards up. Even without Elder Shui warning them, Jeffrey knew that once they crossed that red line, they might die on the spot. Just as they steadily approached the red line, they felt that a strand of consciousness attempted to simultaneously enter their minds. It's a test for the soul," Elder Shui said as if he had already expected this. During his long years of staying in the deep space, he had experienced countless failures. Thus he already had a rough deduction of what to expect within the first 200 feet of the levitation tower. "Elder Shui, can I pass this test?" Jeffrey asked nervously. Although he currently had a cultivation base of a true god, his soul was still not very strong. In fact, he was far inferior to an ordinary other shore realm warrior in terms of strength. It meant that even the soul of an ordinary creature in the deep space was stronger than Jeffrey's. The moment the creature released a little soul pressure, Jeffrey's soul would be in great danger of being extinguished. "You don't have to worry. The tests in the levitation tower have nothing to do with one's strength. Otherwise, most of the creatures that would dare to enter the tower might pass. Don't resist the consciousness, Elder Shui tried to console him. It wasn't that there weren't powerful warriors among the 6 large races of the deep space. However, the tests of the levitation tower were far from ordinary. For the past years, more and more powerful warriors failed to pass the tests in the tower. Therefore, the 6 large races decided to stop sending their powerful warriors because they had already lost so many powerful members in it. After all, every powerful member was necessary for their races to thrive. Once there was an imbalance in terms of the number and strength of one race, the other races would surely take advantage of this and annihilate this weaker race. Jeffrey followed Elder Shui's advice and the consciousness freely entered Jeffrey's mind. The moment it touched his soul, a simple question surfaced in his mind. Who are you? As he heard the question, a strange expression quickly appeared on his face. He wasn't expecting this kind of simple question. At the same time, Elder Shui and the other 3 members of the elemental race showed the same strange reactions on their faces. Soon after, Elder Shui calmed himself and reminded them, just relax and answer the question honestly. Answer honestly, so am I to introduce myself? Jeffrey thought with slight hesitation. Right now, he just had to trust what Elder Shui said, so he answered, my name is Jeffrey Luo. I'm from the chaos. No one exactly knew what the correct answer was. At that moment, Jeffrey just simply conveyed what he thought when asked with that question. After Jeffrey told his self-introduction, a gap appeared from the red line beneath his feet. From the gap, 2 green lines extended, forming a path to advance. Phew, that's pretty easy. Jeffrey shrugged as he let out a sigh. Soon after, Elder Shui and the members of the elemental race also finished answering the question asked by the consciousness. A passageway outlined by green lines also appeared beneath their feet. With this, they continued to go up along the green lines. After they managed to climb up some distance, the wisp of consciousness raised a new question. What is your dream? Dream, that is so vague. Jeffrey slightly tilted his head and was reluctant to answer the question right away. He thought that if the answer was based on the logic of the test from the fostering race, then it should probably be something connected with saving the world or the people. But Jeffrey didn't know if that was how he should answer in this test. When Elder Shui saw that Jeffrey was hesitating, he reminded him again, just answer it honestly. Through Elder Shui's abundant experiences, he already learned that no one could deceive the levitation tower. With the omnipotent method of the fostering race, it would be very easy to tell whether one was lying or not. He knew that his companions might also have the same hesitations, so he repeatedly reminded them to answer the questions with all honesty. Chapter 3828, Dream. My dream. Jeffrey blinked a couple of times, thinking hard about what his dream was. Now, he knew that the whole world was in danger. All he wanted to do was save the world and reunite with his parents. Pondering for a while, he wondered if those were part of his dream. However, he soon concluded that they weren't. Despite everything being hazy at the moment, Jeffrey knew this wasn't his ultimate dream. His mother was the leader of the Cloud Hall, and his father was a legend in every world. While he had lived his whole life in a safe environment, he couldn't help but feel like he was in a prison. He couldn't make decisions on his own, and he couldn't leave without permission. He couldn't live a life he wanted in the Cloud Hall or the Fairy Palace. Ever since Zen went to the Source World, Jeffrey had stayed in his inner world. But he was his father's tool. Whenever Zen needed him to decipher Sanskrit words, he would summon him. Although Zen had given him the illusion of freedom in his inner world, sometimes even creating obstacles for him, Jeffrey knew that everything was still under his father's control. Ultimately, he was safe there, and never needed to stare death in the face. Due to his experiences growing up, Jeffrey didn't really care about anything, since he couldn't even be the master of his own life. As he reflected on his past, he found that his days of happiness only really started when he had set foot in the abstruse energy world from the deleting space. There, he had encountered so many dangers. His parents weren't by his side, so he finally felt the thrill of courting death. Despite the danger, Jeffrey was very happy. Then, it clicked. My dream is to travel the worlds freely, he exclaimed. Even when Jeffrey gave his answer, the consciousness still did not have any reaction. He, Elder Shui, and the others continued to move along the green lines, with no obstructions before them. Elder Shui, this is easier than I thought, Jeffrey said with a nonchalant shrug. It's not that simple, Elder Shui responded, shaking his head. They are just collecting information. Why would they do that? Just as Jeffrey finished speaking, he reached the end of the green lines and a red line suddenly blocked their way. Then, the consciousness suddenly became active in his mind. This time, however, it didn't raise any questions but went straight into Jeffrey's soul. Boom! Jeffrey felt as though a wild, ancient beast had just rammed into him. A white light flashed in his mind briefly, and when he had gathered his bearings, he found himself in a strange world. There was no sign of Elder Shui or the levitation tower. Instead, Jeffrey saw a seemingly unending wilderness. After taking in his surroundings, he saw several old, dilapidated wooden cabins nearby. As Jeffrey made his way towards the cabins, he suddenly heard the pained wails of someone crying. Whipping his head about, he tried to follow the direction of the sound. Finally, his eyes landed on a thin, short girl who was as pale as a ghost in one of the cabins. "Hello," Jeffrey called out from a distance. Since he didn't know where he was, he didn't dare approach the little crying girl. "Hey, why are you crying?" he asked again. The little girl slowly raised her tear-stained face. "It's all your fault, we're all going to die," she wailed. Jeffrey was confused. "What did I do to you? I guess I am in an illusion created by the levitation tower. This must be a test," he quickly figured. His face relaxed when he realized this. Seeing Jeffrey's relaxed expression, the little girl got angrier. "I was created because of you. Dead crows would appear over there. We can't escape from them. We will die here," she spat, resentment written all over her face. Hearing the little girl's words, Jeffrey immediately realized that the little girl's words was an important hint. He raised his head and looked at the end of the wilderness in the distance. A black cloud was steadily approaching, and as he squinted, he realized it was actually a horde of black crows. "The dead crows are coming our way. Run," Jeffrey urged. "No, I am not going anywhere. I can't escape them anyway." The little girl shook her head stubbornly. "Then, I'll leave you here." Without hesitation, Jeffrey turned around abruptly and started to sprint away. As he ran, he muttered to himself, "What the hell is this illusion?" After a while, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. He could sense that the little girl was still wailing, sitting on the ground of one of the cabins. Raising his eyebrows, he turned around and headed back for her. Since the little girl is in this illusion, she must play a role, he thought to himself. Squatting in front of the little girl, he said, "You didn't even give it a try. How would you know that you can't run away from them? This wilderness is very large. The dead crows are very fast. Of course we can't outrun them." The little girl pouted. "Are you familiar with this place?" Jeffrey asked, raising an eyebrow. The little girl shook her head stubbornly. "Anyway, we are doomed. We will die here," she said again. "If we don't run, we will surely die. But if we run now, we might make it out of here. So why don't we give it a shot? If we don't do anything and give up, we will regret it." Jeffrey coaxed her gently. "Look at those dead crows. It'd only take one of them to devour the both of us. Even the nearest city is 100 miles away. We'll be their food before we get there. So, just give up." The little girl huffed with conviction. "Since you know that this world is illusionary, you should know that it is just a test. If you run with me, we will find a way to get rid of them," Jeffrey patiently persuaded. By now, he had already figured out that the little girl was the key to passing the test. "My existence is meaningless. Whether I run or not, I will disappear with the world. So it makes no difference whether I choose to run or stay here," the little girl retorted, her eyes flashing with defiance. "But it'd mean a lot to me," Jeffrey said, unable to hide the annoyance in his voice. He didn't know how to talk the stubborn little girl into going with him. "It's not my responsibility to help you, and I can't help." By now, she had stopped crying. If Jeffrey wasn't mistaken, there seemed to be a hint of malice in her large, twinkling eyes. Quack, 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 the dead crows were steadily closing in on them. Jeffrey could see the ferocity in their eyes. "I've only climbed around 2 feet on the levitation tower. Am I really going to die here?" he thought. He frowned and stood up. All of a sudden, an idea flashed in his mind. "I've been focusing on persuading this little girl. What if I tried another method? There's no way I'm giving up like this," Jeffrey thought to himself resolutely. Lowering his head, he glanced at the little girl. With his eyebrows raised slightly, he suddenly grabbed the little girl by the arm and began to run. The little girl was as light as a kite. He kept running while grabbing the little girl tightly. "Now that you can't help me, let me help you," he said as he sprinted. The little girl didn't resist. Instead, she smiled. Gently waving at the sky, a fan-shaped flame suddenly appeared. In the blink of an eye, all the dead crows were burnt to ashes. Then, a hush fell over the vast wilderness. Even though it was just an illusion, it felt so real. The smell of burning flesh filled Jeffrey's nose. "You passed the test," the little girl said calmly. Jeffrey threw the little girl to the side and panted. Before he could reply, the illusion abruptly disappeared. He was back in the levitation tower. The red line that had blocked him moments prior was now replaced with 2 green lines. As for Elder Shui and the other 3 men from the elemental race, their eyes were still shut tight. It was obvious that they were still trapped in the illusion. Chapter 3829, Afraid of Death. Despite the path continuing before him, Jeffrey didn't rush up the tower. Instead, he stood there and waited patiently. A few minutes later, a member of the elemental race opened his eyes and found himself safe. His eyes gleamed with excitement. He then noticed that Jeffrey had already left the illusion and tried to say something, but Jeffrey didn't understand a single word. Soon, the second one woke up. This left only Elder Shui and the last one stuck in the illusion. "They should wake up soon," Jeffrey said, nodding with certainty. After all, he had seen once before that the pace of the members of the elemental race in the first half of the levitation tower was very fast. It wouldn't take long. However, as soon as he finished speaking, he saw the 2 lines under the feet of the still unconscious member begin to recede. When the other 2 members also took notice, they immediately cried out anxiously, but there was nothing they could do. Everyone had their own path, and they could only move within the lines under their feet. No one dared cross their lines in the slightest. When the lines drew back to the feet of that member, the originally green lines turned red. Then, that member's legs were burned by an invisible flame, until he was nothing but a pile of white ashes. "He is dead," Jeffrey exclaimed in horror, his eyes twitching. Although he was painfully aware that those who entered the levitation tower were willing to sacrifice their lives, he couldn't help but feel depressed with what he just witnessed. At the same time, he was also consumed with worry about Elder Shui's safety. What was taking him so long? Would he die here? Just as Jeffrey felt like his anxiety was eating him alive, Elder Shui's body trembled slightly. When he finally opened his eyes, Jeffrey heaved a sigh of relief. When the 2 members of the elemental race saw Elder Shui wake up, they pointed at the wafting white ashes and jabbered something incomprehensible. Elder Shui understood what they meant. After comforting them, he said to Jeffrey, he must have lied when the levitation tower asked him those questions, so he couldn't pass the test. As I've said many times, no matter what the levitation tower asks, you must tell the truth. Remember this. Elder Shui focused all his efforts on Jeffrey. Just now, he used the death of this member as a learning experience for Jeffrey. "I'll keep that in mind." Jeffrey nodded shakily. He knew he had no choice but to obey Elder Shui, since this was a matter of life and death. Then together, the remaining 4 continued to walk along the green lines. "Those who enter the levitation tower will stay at the height of 20 feet for a while and then rise steadily to the height of 50 feet. I don't think there will be any test during this process," Elder Shui said as he walked. He had observed this many times, and this time he could finally verify his theory. As he said, the 4 of them walked around the levitation tower 2 times, and they encountered no obstacles all the way up to the height of 50 feet. The consciousness in their minds had been silent, but the moment they reached the height of 50 feet, another red line appeared in front of them and blocked their way. At the same time, the consciousness in their minds raised another question. "Are you afraid of death?" When Jeffrey heard this question, his heart skipped a beat. He had a bad feeling about this, but he still answered firmly, "Yes." Boom! The wisp of consciousness once again hit his soul. In the blink of an eye, he found himself in a new illusion. There was a 2-foot-long saber in front of him. Not far away was a large lake. By the lakeside, he saw the figure of the little girl with the pale face again. "Nice to meet you again," the little girl said with a bright, cheerful smile. Jeffrey ignored her momentarily and looked around vigilantly. Since the question this time was about death, he figured the test must have something to do with death. The biggest difficulty of the illusion was that there were too few hints. If he wanted to pass the test, he needed to probe around further. After taking a few apprehensive steps forward, Jeffrey picked up the saber cautiously. Gripping it tightly in his hand, he asked the girl, "Why are you still here? Are you here to help me?" "I won't help you," the little girl said, smiling as though she knew all the secrets of the world. "I just want to watch you die. Those who are afraid of death will surely die." "Watch me die. Those who are afraid of death will surely die," Jeffrey echoed confusedly. Taking another look at his surroundings, he saw that there was only the lake in front of him. Was it going to drown him? With his cultivation base, it was impossible for him to drown, but this was an illusion, so anything was possible. As soon as this dawned on Jeffrey, he noticed a dark shadow moving swiftly at the bottom of the lake. His eyes widened and he immediately retreated a few steps backward. Swoosh! When Jeffrey retreated several hundred feet, a vine shot out from the lake's surface, rushing towards him like an arrow. In the blink of an eye, it coiled around Jeffrey's ankle. Clang, 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 Jeffrey haphazardly chopped at the vine with the saber in his hand. To his horror, the vine was extremely solid, as though it were made of metal. Sparks flew out in all directions whenever he slashed at the vine, but the vine remained unscathed. Before he could think of something, the vine dragged him into the water. Rumble, rumble, just as Jeffrey had suspected, he felt suffocated upon entering the water. He was drowning. Although he struggled madly, the vine was as solid as an iron whip. No matter how hard he tried, he was unable to break free from it. Standing by the lake, the little girl bent over to watch. Looking at Jeffrey who was struggling under the water, she smiled almost innocently, but her eyes betrayed a sense of malice. As Jeffrey felt as though his lungs were about to explode, his consciousness began to wane. If he blacked out, he would really die here. Thinking of how the member of the elemental race had been burnt into a pile of ashes, he shuddered. He definitely didn't want to die that way. I want to live. Gritting his teeth, he was determined to survive. Since the little girl wasn't going to help him, and he couldn't cut the vine, he decided to use the saber on his own self. Making up his mind, he swung the saber at his legs desperately. He hadn't suffered much growing up, but now, at such a critical situation, he moved swiftly and ruthlessly. Crack! Blood began to paint the bottom of the water red as he severed his right leg. Breaking free from his shackles, he swam to the surface of the lake and gasped for air. Just as he was hungrily drinking up oxygen, another vine shot out from the bottom of the lake. This time, it was his left leg that was caught. Crack! This time, Jeffrey became more decisive. Before he was pulled to the bottom of the lake, he sliced off his left leg. Despite it being an illusion, everything felt very real. The pain from severing both his legs was unbearable. Which body parts do you want? Just tell me, I'll give you everything, as long as I can live. Jeffrey roared at the little girl fiercely. The little girl seemed to be a little disappointed. Lowering her head, she thought for a while. It seemed as though she'd lost interest in Jeffrey. This is boring. You are really afraid of death. Then, let's end this. As soon as she finished speaking, the illusion shook and disappeared with her. Jeffrey found himself back in the levitation tower, soaked with sweat. After successfully passing the test, he felt like he was an extremely lucky survivor. Looking to see if his companions had passed too, he was stunned when he saw that Elder Shui and the two members of the elemental race were trembling. What sort of torture were they going through? My answer was, yes, yet the test was so horrible. Elder Shui and the others have a stable state of mind, so they must have answered, no. The illusions they are facing are probably 10 times more difficult, Jeffrey said, shaking his head worriedly. Chapter 3830, Water. The illusions that Elder Shui and the others faced were much more advanced than the one Jeffrey had encountered. However, in terms of life or death struggles, both the elemental race and Elder Shui had been more experienced than Jeffrey. It was no exaggeration to state that all warriors who qualified to enter the levitation tower had already come to regard life and death as unimportant details, and a life or death test wasn't really anything that concerned them. Therefore, Jeffrey didn't wait long before Elder Shui and the two members of the elemental race had safely accomplished the illusions. Upon passing the test, Elder Shui turned to confirm Jeffrey's safety immediately. He was relieved to see that the young man was unscathed. What was your answer to the question? Elder Shui asked out of curiosity. I answered it with honesty. I admitted that I'm afraid of death, said Jeffrey. Oh, truly. Elder Shui was taken aback by this unexpected answer, but he quickly understood the reasoning behind it. Everyone who entered the levitation tower knew there was a great likelihood of dying. Elder Shui and the two members of the elemental race had boldly stated that they were not afraid of death, hence, they had faced much more severe life or death challenges. In particular, Elder Shui had been subject to hundreds of cycles of birth and death in the limited period of time. If it had been Jeffrey, he would have been overwhelmed and succumbed to the pain. Jeffrey's weakness actually worked to his advantage because his tests in the levitation tower had a much lower level of difficulty than the other warriors. If he continued to advance at this pace, it might not be as difficult for him to pass all the tests. Let's move on. Once the red line disappeared, the four of them continued to ascend the spiraling stairs of the levitation tower. 60 feet, 70 feet, 80 feet. When they reached the level that was 90 feet away from the starting point, the mysterious consciousness raised another question. Who will you choose to save in a crisis? Before Jeffrey could answer it, his consciousness was drawn into an illusion again. He saw the same little girl in the illusion. This time, she gave Jeffrey a chance to save his own life or the lives of 10,000 other people. He would have to either sacrifice his life for the 10,000 people, or sacrifice their lives for his own. Jeffrey's sense of self-preservation quickly answered. He selected his own survival with almost no hesitation at all. For the young man, his life was much more valuable than those of irrelevant strangers. Moreover, Elder Shui had repeatedly emphasized the importance of being honest, and that meant he should answer the levitation tower's questions with absolute honesty. He was very confident in his honest answer. In the illusion, those innocent people were slowly submerged in lethal lava. The little girl watched beside Jeffrey. Cold-blooded, she commented. Then, the illusion immediately disappeared from his mind. Soon, Elder Shui and the two members of the elemental race also passed through the test without a hitch. After passing through 3 tests in a row, Jeffrey's expression had become greatly relaxed. Elder Shui, these are actually not soul tests. They didn't involve the strength of soul, nor the level of power, he remarked. I think they were more like designed to test our humanity. I totally agree. Elder Shui nodded. It shouldn't be all that difficult to pass these tests, said Jeffrey. It was hard for him to believe that no one from the 6 great races of the deep space had managed to pass through the levitation tower for a great many years. Elder Shui chuckled and replied, although the elemental race, the cold ape race, and the Rona race are powerful, their civilizations are still at a barbaric stage. They possess a poorly developed humanity. In fact, even though Elder Shui had previously figured out the key to success lay in not lying to the levitation tower, he had never entered the tower himself before. No matter how bright he was, it was impossible for him to guess at the contents of the tests, and he couldn't draw them out of thin air. Therefore, it was most fortunate that they had already come this far. Next, they underwent 3 more tests each time they advanced another 30 feet, and they were drawn into 3 similar illusions. These illusions repeatedly tested their humanity in different ways. It wasn't all that difficult for Jeffrey or Elder Shui since they both stuck to answering truthfully according to their hearts. Unfortunately, one member of the elemental race failed to be honest and was killed at the last test. The remaining 3 of them all passed the height of 180 feet and headed straight for the height of 200 feet. It was the highest record, and while 2 members of the elemental race had achieved it only a few days ago, it had cost their lives. Both Elder Shui and Jeffrey were curious as to what they would encounter from here on. As they ascended the spiraling staircase, they soon discovered that there was a transparent barrier at the height of 200 feet, and it blocked their way ahead. It resembled a transparent glazed door, blocking in the stairway, and dozens of gray masses could be seen floating inside the transparent object. Jeffrey stepped forward and gently touched the transparent barrier. The moment his fingertips touched the surface, layers of ripples appeared, circling outwards. This large transparent barrier appeared to be made up of water. Jeffrey's touch seemed to have activated those gray things. One of these quickly approached the surface of the water near Jeffrey's hand. It suddenly turned into a large gray mouth, biting fiercely towards him. Luckily, the large gray mouth wasn't able to escape the surface of the liquid. It could only flatten and spread inside the liquid. Jeffrey was so frightened, he sat on the ground, and the gray matter quickly turned back into its normal state and retracted. What the hell was that? Jeffrey's face turned white with fright. Elder Shui furrowed his brows. This transparent object obstructed the only passageway. If they wanted to move ahead, they apparently had no other choice but to swim across the liquid. The 2 members of the elemental race who had made it to this point before must have died in the water. Judging from the current situation, would they also die at this place? Let me do it. Noticing Elder Shui's melancholy face, the last remaining member of the elemental race offered, and then went straight into the liquid. Of course, he was not blind to the dangers inside. However, these members of the elemental race were all very respectful to Elder Shui. He was willing to sacrifice himself to discover a way ahead for Elder Shui. No, Elder Shui tried to stop him, but it was too late. As soon as the man plunged into the liquid, one of the gray things immediately noticed him. Splash! The gray thing turned into a large mouth and chomped on his head. Then it transformed into a gray mist, which invaded his brain. The man panicked at this development. When he realized that he was still alive, he waved at Elder Shui to comfort him, and then swam towards the far end of the liquid. When he was about to leave the liquid, his eyes suddenly rolled to the back of his head, and he involuntarily clutched at his head with his hands. His expression became greatly contorted, as if he was suffering from intense pain. Elder Shui had taught them how to endure pain. Their wills had actually become much stronger than that of ordinary creatures. Since he was so overwhelmed by pain, it wasn't hard to imagine what severe tortures he might be suffering. What happened? Jeffrey asked in a tone laced with trepidation. Pop! A muffled sound echoed from within the liquid. The man's head suddenly exploded, and a cloud of gray mist emerged again. The headless corpse of the man slowly floated in the water until it reached the edge and was finally expelled from the water to drop to the ground before Jeffrey and Elder Shui. Since the headless corpse had crossed the green lines, it was quickly turned to ashes by the levitation tower. Jeffrey stood transfixed into silence for several minutes before he asked, "We can't pass through this place at all. Shall we turn back now?" Chapter 3831, Reward. Jeffrey knew he wouldn't be able to go back at all. Still, he was frightened, so he couldn't help asking that question. Elder Shui said nothing. He looked away, observing the gray things in the water. Here, at the height of 200 feet in the levitation tower, he had never thought there would be such things. He felt a strange calmness wash over him. He considered several possibilities, in line with the long-standing motto of the Bold Conjecture House: boldly make a hypothesis, carefully verify it. He had come up with that on his own. Jeffrey, does the aura of these things strike you as somewhat familiar? Asked Elder Shui. Familiar? No, Jeffrey admitted, shaking his head. It was the first time he had seen such things. Elder Shui thought for a while. After a few moments, he headed straight towards the water. He plunged his head in with a splash. As soon as his head was inside the clear water, one of the gray things swam quickly towards him. It spread out, forming the shape of sharp teeth, and started to bite him. Elder Shui immediately withdrew his head before the thing could bite him. Drops of water trickled down his face. The gray thing couldn't leave the water. It lingered in the spot where Elder Shui's head had been and spread outwards, before slowly retreating. Elder Shui repeated this action several more times, as though he was teasing the gray thing. As soon as it swam away, he poked his head back into the transparent water. Each time, the gray thing rushed back, but not quickly enough to succeed in biting Elder Shui. Elder Shui, why are you doing that? Jeffrey asked, wondering what game he was playing with the gray thing. I'm trying to sense its aura. It's a pity that it's in water, because the water is blocking most of its aura, making it difficult to sense. I wanted to get a clear confirmation of what I was thinking, Elder Shui answered. What did you learn? What kind of aura is it? Jeffrey said. He himself had no idea. Elder Shui smiled. I already knew, and I just wanted to make sure, he said, tapping his temple lightly. The wisp of consciousness that entered our minds before is very similar to this aura. Jeffrey was interested. Really, if the aura of the things in the water is similar to the aura of that consciousness, then it's possible that these are the souls of the fostering race, Elder Shui finished. As usual with him, it was a clever and bold assumption. The souls of the fostering race, exclaimed Jeffrey in surprise. He wasn't entirely convinced. But why would they put their souls here? Just to attack us? Elder Shui did not respond at once, as he mulled over the implications of his assumption. Finally, he said, I can't be sure, but there's a good chance it is a reward. A reward? Jeffrey repeated, thoroughly confused. Just now, that member of the elemental race had been killed miserably in front of them. How could it have anything to do with a reward? Moreover, a few days ago, the two members of the elemental race had also climbed to this height. Both had also stopped here. Elder Shui ignored Jeffrey's obvious skepticism. He went on, it's impossible for the fostering race to set up an insurmountable barrier. That's just because we haven't found a way, but it can't be a reward, Jeffrey objected. Elder Shui stared at Jeffrey. If a random human being with a strength level similar to yours or even weaker than you entered the levitation tower, do you think there would be a high probability of that human passing the 6 tests? Jeffrey didn't understand why Elder Shui had asked this question. He hesitated and then said, the probability of passing is very high. Those tests of human nature were not too difficult. If his father or Rocher took part in the tests, they would definitely pass them. Over the countless long years, about 2 million people from the 6 races of the deep space have entered the levitation tower. But only you, me, and 3 members of the elemental race have come this far. Don't you feel that strange? Elder Shui asked, trying to make Jeffrey see his reasoning. Jeffrey had to admit that analysis wasn't his strong suit, but as Elder Shui spoke, Jeffrey tried to follow his thoughts. He asked, could it be that the so-called 6 large races of the deep space are too stupid? As for human beings, even if they were placed in the savage land, they would probably develop a high level of intelligence after a few thousand years at most. That period of time would be enough for a civilization to rise and their race to become prosperous. Meanwhile, the 6 large races in the deep space had existed for a long time. The elemental race had even been cultivated by Elder Shui. It was strange indeed if the members of these races had not yet developed a high level of intelligence. After the deep space was broken, the conditions for advanced civilization were lost. These 6 races are like earthworms and ants that live underground. They have been restricted since they were born, so even if I teach them as much as I can, they can only learn so much. They still underperform and act unwisely on many occasions, said Elder Shui. He added, if you put a wisp of soul into an ant or an earthworm, what will happen? Their heads would explode. Jeffrey spoke tentatively. He had never imagined such a thing. Yes, replied Elder Shui, pointing at the white ashes on the ground. From the perspective of the fostering race, the members of the elemental race are ants, earthworms and bugs on the ground. They can't bear the souls of the fostering race at all, so they exploded and were killed. What about us? You think our heads will not explode? Jeffrey asked. We have no choice but to take a risk. With a loud splash, Elder Shui went straight into the transparent water. Although he had the physical body of a member of the elemental race, his soul was a human spirit. He came from the main world, but he was still more confident than his companions from the elemental race. Once more, the gray thing formed teeth and approached Elder Shui. It bit him, and then it drilled into his head continuously. Jeffrey watched with his mouth open. He found the scene terrifying. Elder Shui's eyes rolled and his body twitched repeatedly. Jeffrey stared, afraid that Elder Shui's head would explode any second now. 3 seconds passed, and then 6, 9. Around a minute later, Elder Shui finally stopped trembling. He floated calmly in the transparent water. His gaze met Jeffrey's, and there was a deep, profound look in his eyes. He crooked his finger at him. You can really bear it, Jeffrey said excitedly, rushing forward. He started to enter the transparent water, but he stopped as soon as he approached the surface. He had forgotten that he was different from Elder Shui. Elder Shui was no ordinary human spirit, but among the strongest ones. Jeffrey was a human being from the chaos, and he was only a true god. The gap between them was too big. Elder Shui could bear it, but Jeffrey might not be able to. Elder Shui, how about I wait for you here? You can save me after you get the heavenly ring staff, Jeffrey said, smiling weakly at him. Unexpectedly, Elder Shui swam from the transparent water. He stretched out a hand, grabbed Jeffrey by the neck, and dragged him into the transparent water. The water splashed around them as Elder Shui submerged Jeffrey in the depths. Another gray thing promptly swam towards Jeffrey. Like a blooming gray flower, the thing wrapped petal-shaped arms around Jeffrey's head, and drilled into his mind. Jeffrey trembled. He felt an intense, swelling pain as the powerful soul force forced its way into his mind. The soul power was very pure and untainted. Because it had no owner, Jeffrey absorbed it very smoothly and naturally. As the soul assimilated fully into Jeffrey's mind, the pain grew, becoming unbearable. He felt like his head was about to crack open. Chapter 3832, The World of Nothingness. Jeffrey almost had never experienced any sort of hardship before. How could he tolerate such an intense pain now? At this moment, the pain had shut out his ability to think. He only hoped that he could pass out and escape the situation he was in somehow. However, the soul power continued to strengthen his soul, and at the same time, the pain that wrung through his entire body with it grew much stronger. It seemed like endless torture that refused to meet an end. He suffered in silence as the pain had him writhe and groan. It was killing him to have to tolerate it unwillingly. When he was about to open his mouth to release the pressure, the water forcefully poured itself in. His time of soul infusion was only 30 seconds longer than that of Elder Shui, but Jeffrey felt those minor seconds to be equal to those of a century. After it was over, Jeffrey remained in the water without moving for a while, staring up into space. His newly acquired powerful soul made him have a new perception of the world, so he just lay there, taking his moment to digest it all in. My soul, I can feel it. How did it become so powerful? After processing his thoughts and coming to terms with his newly acquired abilities, Jeffrey swam out of the transparent water. The moment his eyes made contact with Elder Shui, they reflected unparalleled momentum. Of course, Elder Shui quickly caught on with the change in Jeffrey at one glance. As a top-level master in the main world, Elder Shui's soul was extremely powerful. After he absorbed the soul power of the fostering race, his soul power had increased by 4 times, but Jeffrey was different from him. Jeffrey was a mere true god in the chaos. Because of the difference in their status and abilities, after he went through the ordeal of absorbing the soul power of the fostering race, his soul had probably grown exponentially. This feeling, it's like no other I have ever felt. It's amazing. Jeffrey eyed himself up as he exclaimed with excitement. A while ago, he was writhing in pain and prayed for it to stop. But now, he seemed to have forgotten all about it after having obtained such great power in return. He felt as though he had been reborn. Elder Shui shared his excitement. It was indeed a great surprise that they could strengthen their souls to such a level. But soon as the excitement wore off and he began to collect his thoughts, he turned to Jeffrey and asked, "Why do you think they infuse such a surging soul power into us?" The levitation tower was the last standing hope left by the fostering race as a symbol of their existence before they were annihilated. They were an astute race, and nothing they did was pointless. There must have been a reason why they chose to strengthen Jeffrey's and Elder Shui's souls. "I guess we'll know when we go up," Jeffrey said as he pointed to the top of the tower. Elder Shui gave him a slight nod, then continued to walk up the steps alongside him. After they left the transparent water, the green lines that once portrayed the path they could walk on disappeared. When they made their way onto the next floor, which was 210 feet high, they saw a ball appear before their eyes in the center. The ball hung loosely in the air. It was free of all imperfections. It was as if it was carved with utmost intricacy. There were no flaws on any side of it. However, just as they stared deeply at the ball, they suddenly felt themselves being slowly consumed with strong feelings of loneliness. The ball seemed to be in existence for as long as forever. It had no meaning attached to its life. It was without a beginning or an end. "What's wrong with this ball?" Jeffrey asked in a concerned tone. Elder Shui kept his gaze fixated on the ball as he walked and gave his shoulders a light shrug, indicating his lack of knowledge about it as well. At this moment, a faint light appeared before them, stopping them in their tracks. The light continued to twist and changed its form continuously until it finally manifested itself into a little girl. It was the same little girl that Jeffrey had encountered several times in the previous illusions. "Nice to meet you again," the girl spoke indifferently with her hands clasped behind her back as she leaned towards him. Jeffrey began to look around in all directions in a frantic state before he asked nervously, "Is this an illusion, or is this real?" The little girl shook her head at his confusion and replied in a monotonous voice, "It's real." But Elder Shui could see through the little girl and tell that the girl herself was an illusion. "If that's really the case then, what are you doing here?" Jeffrey asked as he raised his brows. In fact, he understood that the little girl was somehow connected to the levitation tower. The levitation tower needed a person to communicate with Jeffrey. The little girl was created to serve that purpose. "I'll be your guide. Let me help you climb up from here on," the little girl said, her face devoid of all emotions as she beckoned them to follow her. "Thank you for the offer, but I think we'll be fine on our own," Jeffrey said blatantly as he refused her help with a wave of his hand. The little girl paid no heed to his remark and pointed towards the lifeless ball. "This is the world of nothingness. It is infinitely large and small at the same time. It contains everything, and yet it also remains empty. It's the first-grade world." Jeffrey still chose to ignore her and brushed her words aside. However, Elder Shui's expression switched drastically after he heard what she had to say. He pointed towards the ball and asked, "Are you telling me that this is the first-grade world? The real first-grade world?" "Of course not." The little girl cut his confusion short with a curt reply. She stared at Elder Shui with eyes filled with mockery as if to look down on him. "The world of nothingness contains all kinds of things. Even an insignificant needle wouldn't be able to escape it. If it really were to appear, you'd instantly become a part of it, and if that happened, you wouldn't even be able to stand here." "Is this world of nothingness a creation of the fostering race?" Elder Shui asked again. "No, it isn't." The little girl shook her head. "It was created by Clarence." "And who is this Clarence that you speak of?" Elder Shui continued to ask one question, followed by the other, to dissolve his confusion. The girl tilted her head and placed her finger on her chin as if she was lost in thought. "He owns everything, and he has created everything." After giving a brief, yet vague explanation, she continued while pointing her finger upwards, "To advance further, you just need to climb up. That's not so hard. We'll be fine." Jeffrey shrugged as if to refuse all her help. The atmosphere in the world of nothingness really did have an eerie vibe to it, but what could it possibly do? At most, it could only manage to affect something so little as his mood, right? That was not so bad. Without giving the ball a second glance, Jeffrey continued to climb up, ignorant of his surroundings and the situation he was putting himself in because of his arrogance. Seeing Jeffrey's indifferent behavior, the little girl just smiled and shook her head in disapproval in silence. After they walked 2 circles around the levitation tower, they reached the height of 230 feet. There, the ball disappeared out of sight, along with the lingering desolate feeling brewing inside of them. However, just as they took the next step forward, a huge wall appeared before them in the center of the tower. The wall was crafted with several intricate patterns, consisting of squares and circles of various sizes all interlinked with each other, along with different sets of lines that formed unusual things. What you see before you is the wall world, the second-grade world, the little girl explained from behind in her usual monotonous voice. To Jeffrey and Elder Shui, the wall world was nothing more than a picture. However, it felt relieving compared to the world of nothingness they experienced earlier. They could even sense faint signs of vitality emanating from the lines that formed vivid pictures of living creatures etched on the wall world. This is not a test at all. It's just a brief visit, Jeffrey scoffed as he gave his shoulders a slight shrug. The little girl seemed frustrated from Jeffrey's continued arrogant demeanor. Unable to withstand it any longer, she snapped at him, "The world of nothingness and the wall world are at lower levels compared to your world, which is why you remain unaffected. When you are confronted with the higher grade worlds up there, I'll see if you can still speak as arrogantly as you do now." Elder Shui was taken aback by the little girl's strong statement. He began to piece everything together and finally figured out the reason why the fostering race bestowed them with their current soul power. Next, they would have to go through the baptism of the higher grade worlds. The higher the grade of the worlds, the more information they contained, and the higher the requirements for the souls. Could I withstand the 6th grade world with my current soul power? What about the 7th grade world? And the 8th grade world? While Elder Shui pondered over his limitations, his eyes fell on Jeffrey, who remained beside him. As a creature from the 3rd grade world, Jeffrey was surprisingly able to move freely in the 4th grade and the 5th grade worlds. Perhaps he could be able to reach those higher worlds with ease compared to Elder Shui himself. Even though Elder Shui harbored these concerns in his head, he didn't voice them out to Jeffrey. Instead, he continued to climb up alongside Jeffrey without uttering a word. After another climb of 20 feet, they came across the 3rd grade world. This was the world Jeffrey was most familiar with. Jeffrey had been away from the chaos for a steady period. Suddenly coming face to face with his world made him stop in his tracks as he stared blankly at it. Upon seeing things he was once familiar with, he couldn't help but feel homesick. But then, he lowered his gaze to shake the feeling off. Then came the 4th grade world. This time, it was Elder Shui who started to experience deep feelings of nostalgia with one short glimpse of it. After all, he had spent a fair amount of time in the 5th grade world and never got the chance to return to the main world. When they continued their climb and reached a height of 300 feet, they were faced with the 5th grade world. This world did not pose any difficulty for them as they had no feelings attached to it like the previous ones. This is the 5th grade world, known as the Stellar World. Those are the members of our now perished fostering race, the little girl introduced. Just as Jeffrey laid his eyes on the creatures of the fostering race, he broke out in a fit of laughter. Seriously, those are the members of your fostering race. They look so funny. Elder Shui had never seen the members of the fostering race before. He didn't expect them to look so naive and cute to the eyes. However, his reaction wasn't as offensive as the one Jeffrey portrayed. He nudged Jeffrey with his elbow and shook his head to gesture him to stop laughing. Chapter 3833, The Soul Reincarnation. The little girl, who was leading the way, didn't want to entertain Jeffrey's rudeness. She knew that there was such a huge gap between civilizations. Thus she couldn't believe and imagine why Jeffrey could laugh at it. As she took the two of them to climb another 20 feet, the 6th grade world welcomed them. However, Elder Shui quickly stopped just before they entered the 6th grade world. He noticed that the steps in front of him were no longer visible. What he could only see were these mysterious-looking square frames. At one moment, they would merge to form larger frames, and then the next moment, they would quickly divide again into the smaller ones. It was a cycle that didn't make sense to him. As a creature of the 4th grade world, it was extremely difficult for Elder Shui to fully grasp the deep space. In fact, he only managed to adapt to the deep space because he was able to obtain the physical body of the elemental race by chance. Now that he was about to enter the 6th grade world, he had some worries that he might not be able to adapt to it. I know what you're thinking. This is the world of no limits. It won't be that easy for you to adapt, the little girl said with a straight face. If I can't adapt, can I pass it? Elder Shui asked, just to make sure. Although he had reached so far in the levitation tower, he still wanted to leave alive. Right now, there was just the two of them. If he wouldn't be able to make it, there was still Jeffrey. If Jeffrey could still go up smoothly, he would have no regrets. He could place all his hopes on the young man without reservations. Of course not. That's not how it works, the little girl answered straightforwardly. She even wondered why the elder would ask such a question. You must be able to completely adapt to this world and see everything clearly before you can pass. Adapt to this world, see everything clearly. Elder Shui almost laughed at the little girl's statement. It's impossible for the creatures from the lower grade worlds to do what you're saying. Even the masters of your race weren't able to do it. What are you saying? Just accept the soul reincarnation. This way, the creatures from a lower grade world would be able to comprehend a higher grade world. What's the point of the levitation tower bestowing you such a strong soul power? Think about it. It is so you can withstand the soul reincarnation, the little girl explained. After listening to her, Elder Shui finally understood this simple logic. Actually, he remembered that there was a technique in the Four Spirit sect that was similar to the soul reincarnation. It was the Red Jade Rite that was developed by the Bold Conjecture House. Using this method, the third-grade creatures were able to smoothly transform into fourth-grade ones. However, the drawback of this method was that the creatures would have to endure a lot of pain in the process. Once they failed to withstand it, they would eventually be shattered to pieces. I see. Then let's see how many times I can withstand the soul reincarnation. After saying that, Elder Shui took a step forward with a determined expression on his face. As he stepped into the world of no limits, he instantly felt that his entire body transformed into the countless square frames of various sizes that he saw earlier. All of his senses had undergone violent changes that he couldn't determine what was going on. While Elder Shui quickly fell into a state of panic, he saw a bright red square frame appear before him. This frame enveloped him, and he felt like his body was being cut into countless pieces. He realized that this sensation wasn't coming from his physical body, but directly from his soul. It could be said that he was just hallucinating, but he had no way of knowing for sure. He only felt that his body and soul were in immense pain and suffering. There was no way to avoid the pain, and he couldn't even pass out. He could only resist it through his willpower. He needed to overcome this or he might not be able to return to his original form. This went on for 5 minutes before the process suddenly stopped. The frames began to arrange themselves and combine together to form a unique rule. While this was happening, Elder Shui gradually understood the rule and saw the steps in the 6th grade world. Did I finish the soul reincarnation? Elder Shui asked as he gasped for air. Yes, the little girl standing beside him replied briefly. It seemed that she had been there this whole time and was completely unaffected by the shift to the 6th grade world. It's his turn now, she continued as she pointed at Jeffrey who was still standing at the other side. Just now, Jeffrey was able to clearly see the pain and agony that Elder Shui underwent. Since he had no choice but to proceed, he got very nervous. If I can understand the 6th grade world, does it mean that I don't need to undergo this soul reincarnation? The little girl glanced at him coldly and was annoyed at his procrastination. Cut the crap and just step over here. With that, Jeffrey was forced to step inside. The rules of the two worlds were completely different. As soon as a creature made a step into the higher grade world, he shouldn't be able to take the next one without experiencing the soul reincarnation. However, to the little girl's surprise, Jeffrey entered the 6th grade world and proceeded to walk up the stairs easily. The little girl couldn't believe what she just saw. You came from the 6th grade world? No, I don't think so. Did you experience the soul reincarnation already? But that was too fast. Jeffrey just shrugged his shoulders while the little girl was still busy analyzing what had really happened. The fact still remained that he was able to travel through different worlds effortlessly. In fact, Jeffrey had no idea about the soul reincarnation, so he must have not experienced it. At the same time, Elder Shui, whose face was still pale, let out a faint smile as he saw Jeffrey's relaxed expression as he walked around. His confidence grew stronger that even if he couldn't make it, Jeffrey still had a huge chance. As he climbed up the steps of the 6th grade world, Jeffrey couldn't avert his eyes from the center of the tower. Hey, what are those square stone tablets over there? He finally asked out of curiosity. Those are not stone tablets. They are the sacred spirits, the little girl answered, quite annoyed at Jeffrey's ignorance. Huh, did you mean that those are the stone tablets set up for the sacred spirits? Jeffrey asked again, confused at the little girl's earlier answer. No, you heard me right the first time. They are the sacred spirits, the strongest race in the world of no limits. They are also the origin of the fostering race, the little girl replied in an impatient tone. According to the rules, she shouldn't get emotional at any time. However, the guy in front of her was really starting to get on her nerves. Then why do they look like stone tablets? It is ominous and ridiculous, Jeffrey remarked indifferently. Elder Shui, who walked in front of them, was rendered speechless. He could only shake his head helplessly as he heard Jeffrey's comments. Even the little girl just stayed silent as she gritted her teeth. After they passed the 6th grade world, they had already reached a total height of 360 feet. The little girl stopped for a moment as she was about to introduce the next world. At this moment, Elder Shui's legs started to slightly tremble. In the past, if he had an opportunity to experience the soul reincarnation, he would be deeply overjoyed. However, after experiencing it once, he realized that the pain it brought was totally unbearable. He also got the hint from the little girl that as the grade of the world got higher, the pain from the soul reincarnation would also increase. This is the 7th grade world, the boundless divine world. Please come in, the little girl said with an emotionless face. This time, her gaze was fixed on Jeffrey. She really wanted to see him suffer the torture bestowed by the soul reincarnation. But unexpectedly, just like what happened in the 6th grade world, Jeffrey walked in leisurely and proceeded to look at the center of the levitation tower. His eyes lit up as if he had seen something amusing. Bamboos. There are so many bamboos. Don't tell me that they are the natives of the boundless divine world. This guy, the little girl's eyes widened in surprise. Upon seeing that Jeffrey still roamed around in a carefree manner, she was both shocked and frustrated at the same time. This is already the 7th grade world. He is neither a 5th grade nor a 6th grade creature. Then, he's a 7th grade creature. That should be a nasty joke. Why isn't the soul reincarnation activated on him? Is there something wrong with the levitation tower? But, it couldn't be. It worked just fine with the elder earlier. While she was still at a loss for words, Elder Shui took the liberty to step into the 7th grade world. With his first step, he instantly fell into the torture of the soul reincarnation once again. Seeing this, the little girl was fully convinced that there was nothing wrong with the levitation tower. As she looked towards Jeffrey, she finally realized that his ability was way beyond her imagination. Does it mean that the worlds of different grades do not affect you? That was all the little girl could conclude at this point. I honestly don't know, Jeffrey answered frankly. He then pointed at the stairs and said, if we continue to go up, we'll know. Chapter 3834, Boundless Perfect World. Jeffrey had long wanted to know why he could go through worlds completely unaffected. Now was his chance. The worlds he was visiting became more complex and obscure as time went by, but he reached them with no problems just the same. He wanted to know what connection he had with these worlds. But Elder Shui had already been subjected to much agony, and the soul reincarnation in the 7th grade world proved even more tortuous than the last. He managed to endure it, but it was clearly taking a heavy toll on him. When warriors of the elemental race suffered from some debilitating condition, their faces turned paler and paler, then began to wrinkle. Elder Shui's face was now so white and covered with wrinkles, it resembled a crumpled piece of paper. It was a clear testament to the ordeal he had gone through. Go on ahead. Don't wait for me. Keep climbing, Elder Shui said weakly, stopping to catch his breath. A look of deep concern crossed Jeffrey's face as he saw the state Elder Shui was in. Do you need to rest? He could afford to wait. There was no time limit in the levitation tower anyway. But the little girl piped up, resting is futile. Undergoing the soul reincarnation always leaves behind a great pressure on the body. There is no fixing it. Elder Shui nodded at this. The red jade rite of the Four Spirits sect had a similar effect. It could allow creatures of 3rd grade world to be able to become creatures of 4th grade world, but it also imposed a mental strain which could never be lifted. Elder Shui was able to bear it if he had only crossed a world, but as a 4th grade world creature in a 7th grade world, he was already stretched to the limit. Then what should we do? Go back, Jeffrey said, frowning as he mulled the situation. The little girl sighed exasperatedly, I could just end his life. After all, she thought, she really could. Jeffrey chose not to respond to that. He hurried over to Elder Shui's side to support him as he struggled to climb up. Elder Shui sighed. I'm afraid the 8th grade world will be the death of me, he said, before being overcome with a coughing fit. But I wouldn't know what to do if you died, Jeffrey bewailed. Jeffrey had been ambitious and self-sufficient before Elder Shui came along, but now, he would feel quite lost without him. To Jeffrey's surprise, Elder Shui straightened up, grabbed his collar and lifted him a foot off the ground with a sudden burst of power. Snap out of it. Do everything you can to get the heavenly ring staff. Even if I get it, I wouldn't know how to get back, Jeffrey muttered. Don't forget that I'll just be losing this form. The real me is still outside the Sky Wheel City. Elder Shui had gotten so riled up that he appeared to recover his energy a little. His face began to regain color and lose some of the wrinkles. Jeffrey sighed and gave in. Fine, I'll give it my all, he mumbled. Louder, Elder Shui commanded firmly. I'll give it my all. Jeffrey shouted. The grip on his collar loosened and Jeffrey found himself on the ground again. Elder Shui fell back into a stoop and continued the arduous trek up. They had to circle around the levitation tower thrice and climb 30 feet to reach the 8th grade world. Had he been alone, Jeffrey would have sped right through it, but having to assist Elder Shui, it took a full 15 minutes. Finally, the 8th grade world lay before them. The boundless intent world. It was a sight to behold. It was like a work of art in Elder Shui's eyes. The world was full of color, interweaving into each other but remaining distinct at the same time. Elder Shui knew that the 8th grade world would kill him at this rate, but with an encouraging pat on Jeffrey's shoulder, he walked in without hesitation. He already felt blessed having laid eyes on the boundless intent world. The moment he set foot into the world, however, Elder Shui immediately felt like he was being torn into tiny pieces. His body started to dissipate until finally, there was nothing left. In contrast, Jeffrey entered the world entirely unharmed. That was, save for his despair. As they had feared, the 8th grade world was, indeed, the end for Elder Shui. Jeffrey hadn't known Elder Shui for a long time, but the old man had brought him this far. Jeffrey also knew Elder Shui was an important figure in the Four Spirits sect, and that it was him who had helped his father, Zen, to accomplish all that he had achieved. Jeffrey became vaguely aware that the little girl was praising his ability to pass smoothly through worlds, but he couldn't find it in himself to appreciate anything right now. He simply steeled himself and strode onward. Outside the levitation tower, the races of the deep space were in an uproar, witnessing everything. Not long after the members of the elemental race entered, one of them died. This was the subject of much mockery from the cold ape race. Most of them, after all, could at least still survive more than 20 to 30 feet up. Eventually, however, members of the elemental race were able to reach a height of 200 feet. No one could break that record. Then, what was more surprising was that 2 light orbs ascended further up. The deep space races had been stunned at the sight. Exclamations had broken out when they saw one of the light orbs suddenly get snuffed out. Some felt vindicated, while others felt pity. Most of them hoped, of course, that the members of their own race could climb all the way up to the top of the levitation tower, but there were still some who were more afraid to die. They would rather see someone finally put an end to this deadly tower. The elemental race now gave them hope. That's 400 feet, now. Is that Elder Shui? Maybe it's that new guy. Tension gripped the deep space races as they stared up at the last light orb, different thoughts and theories running through their minds. In the oval-shaped building at the edge of the square, the little monster from the elemental race who had been left behind likewise kept his eyes on the light orb, not even daring to blink. He had come in on the same day as Jeffrey. If everyone died in the levitation tower, everything would fall on him. He had watched with increasing dismay and fear as other green light orbs had been snuffed out one after another in the tower. Now, he could do nothing but pray fervently. 410 feet. 420 feet. 430 feet. The boundless void world. 440 feet. 450 feet. 460 feet. The boundless secondary world. 470 feet. 480 feet. 490 feet. The boundless shock world. Jeffrey passed worlds of higher and higher grades, more and more changing scenery that would have astounded any observer. His father would have cherished the sights. Jeffrey, however, grew bored of them quickly. The consecutive drastic change in scenery was exhausting. The boundless shock world is the 12th grade world, a world the closest to perfect. A grade higher, and that would be the boundless perfect world. The little girl was still informing him. Have I reached the top? Jeffrey interrupted her. But the 13th grade world, the boundless perfect world, cannot be restored here. Even Clarence couldn't do that. Therefore, there are only 12 small worlds in the levitation tower, the little girl rattled on, adamant that Jeffrey should know this. I just want to know if I've reached the top. Jeffrey pressed. Infuriated, the little girl stopped her lecture. If you had just listened, you would know you are at 490 feet, and you will reach the top at the next level. Go on up, then, if you can. She snapped, a challenge in her voice. Chapter 3835, The Second Reward. Jeffrey looked up. He stepped forward without hesitation. Now that he'd come so far, what else was there to fear? At the end of the boundless shock world, the staircase stopped in front of an ordinary stone door. In contrast with the rest of the exquisite levitation tower, the surface of the door was rough and unpolished. Jeffrey did not stop to think it over. He reached out and pushed the door open. The door creaked as it swung open. It had not been opened for many years, but the rough material was still intact. As soon as he saw what lay behind the door, Jeffrey paused, surprised. Through the doorway was a space as rough and craggy as the door itself. It was as though every inch of ground had been filled in with crushed, jagged stones. The space inside the door belonged to the fifth-grade world. The levitation tower had become normal at this point. However, that wasn't Jeffrey's main concern. "Where is the heavenly ring staff?" Jeffrey asked, turning to face the little girl. The little girl stood a step behind him, making no move to pass through the door. She did not have the right to enter the top floor. "Go in and find it yourself," she answered, still feeling a sense of dissatisfaction towards Jeffrey. Jeffrey nodded. He stepped into the room at the top floor and looked around him. His gaze landed on a purple crystal pillar in the center of the space. He walked towards it, examining it closely. When he got closer, he saw that there seemed to be some wooden object embedded in the pillar. His eyes lit up as he realized what it was. "This is the heavenly ring staff." The staff had a strange, unwieldy shape, which was why Jeffrey hadn't recognized it immediately. However, since it was the only object of note on the top floor of the levitation tower, it must be the heavenly ring staff. Jeffrey felt as though he was about to burst with excitement. He'd finally found it. Right now, this was the most important thing in the world to him. He moved back a few paces and raised his left hand, spreading his fingers. At the same time, he balled his right hand into a fist, allowing energy to flow through him. He sent a blast of power towards the pillar. The blast crashed into the purple crystal. But there was no boom, only a faint, muffled sound. The purple crystal pillar was completely unharmed by the blast. It had not moved an inch, nor had it sustained any cracks or other damage. Jeffrey was taken aback. He prepared to use several more thurgies to obtain the staff from inside the pillar. With his cultivation base as a true god, he was powerful in the universe. But he was weak in the divine land, let alone in this fifth-grade world. He displayed his full power and pushed himself to the limit, but it was no use. The purple crystal still stood there. He could not even leave a single scratch on the pillar. Jeffrey stopped to assess the situation. He realized that he simply wasn't strong enough to get the staff within the pillar. "It's a pity that Elder Shui couldn't hold on any longer," he muttered to himself. "If he had managed to come here with me before he died, he could have broken open the pillar since he had the physical body of the elemental race." Jeffrey returned to the door, deciding to ask the little girl for help. After all, she was the guide of the levitation tower. She might not help him, but it was worth a shot. It had not been easy for him to reach the top floor of the tower, and he was unwilling to give up after all his effort. He needed to find a way to break the pillar. Unfortunately, the little girl seemed puzzled, and unable to offer any direct solution. "This is beyond my abilities," she said. "I can't enter this door, and I don't know how to unravel what's inside. But I think that Clarence, in his infinite wisdom, would never leave you in a dead end. Try to explore further and search for clues inside." Jeffrey was disappointed at the vague answer, but still, what she said made sense. He re-entered through the doorway of the top floor. He glanced around again. Except for the purple crystal pillar and these rough stones, there is nothing else. "So, since I can't break the purple crystal pillar, I must find the answer in these rough stones," he mused. He bent to examine the rough stones beneath his feet, and found that each stone had a series of small bulges on its surface. Each bulge was about the size of his fist. A thought flashed through Jeffrey's mind. Could there be something hidden in these stones? He wondered. He extended a hand towards a nearby stone, scratching its surface. The rough stone was softer than it looked, as it was made of sand. In moments, Jeffrey had used his fingers to pry sand from its surface. It took some effort, but eventually, the sand was cleared off, exposing an oval object. Jeffrey's eyes narrowed as he stared at the object. It looked soft, like a piece of flesh embedded in stone, and he could feel heat and energy rising from it. "What's this?" he said to himself. Without giving it a second thought, Jeffrey reached down with both hands, grabbing at the fleshy oval object to pull it out from the stone. To his astonishment, as soon as he touched it, the soft flesh sank down beneath his grip. His 10 fingers were embedded in the object. He immediately tried to pull away, but his fingers were stuck. Like melted candy, the fleshy object had integrated with his hands. It was stuck to his skin and he could not pull loose no matter how hard he tried. "This thing has drilled into my hands." Jeffrey muttered in surprise. Inwardly, he was greatly unsettled. Calm down, he told himself, trying to control his nerves. Here, there was no one to rely on but himself. He could not afford to give in to his panic. He could feel the flesh continuously integrating with his hands, but it was not painful at all. Indeed, the only sensation was an enveloping warmth. As Jeffrey watched, unable to do anything, the flesh fused with his own tissue, spreading along the surface of his arms. He found it deeply disturbing, but as far as he could tell, it wasn't doing him any harm. Several minutes later, the flesh seemed to have completely integrated with his body. Jeffrey could find no sign of the fusion except that his hands were slightly thicker, and looked a tad more awkward. Still, he was able to move freely, and to his shock, he soon realized that his strength had increased significantly. This flesh contained astonishing energy. This is a reward, Jeffrey spluttered, flexing his fingers experimentally. When he had reached the height of 200 feet, the levitation tower had given him and Elder Shui a reward for their souls. Now, he had received a reward for his physical body. As long as I absorb enough flesh, I can break the purple crystal pillar. He exclaimed. Jeffrey finally knew what he needed to do. He began vigorously scratching at the bulges on the surface of another rough stone near him. When he removed the layer of sand on the surface, he saw another lump of oval flesh. He grabbed the flesh without hesitation, allowing it to integrate into his body. By his estimation, there were about 400 rough stones like this on the top floor. Jeffrey patiently dug out the oval flesh one by one, absorbing each into his body. As he worked, Jeffrey felt a tremendous change in his body. After consuming the flesh in hundreds of stones, he realized that his body size had expanded to 4 times its normal size. My soul is comparable to those of the masters in the deep space, and my physical body has now also reached a high level. If I return to the chaos, the strength of my physical body alone would be enough to terrify my father, Jeffrey thought. Finally, he grabbed the last stone. With his newfound strength, he needed only to scratch the surface lightly to get out the flesh from within. He absorbed the final piece of flesh. Then he stood straight, stretching out his arms and legs, testing his increased strength. He felt invigorated and very powerful. Feeling anticipation rise inside him, he headed back towards the purple crystal pillar. The heavenly ring staff is mine now, he cried. He clenched his hand into a fist and punched the pillar with all his might. This time, there was an ear-splitting cracking sound. The top portion of the solid purple crystal pillar splintered, then smashed into pieces. The upper half of the heavenly ring staff was revealed. Chapter 3836, Leave. Based on appearance alone, there was nothing special about the heavenly ring staff. It just looked like a piece of old wood with a frail-looking bottom side and a slightly thick top side. The crown at its top was messily spread out, making it appear a bit bloated and peculiar. All in all, it gave a mysterious impression, like a delicate artwork. Jeffrey stretched out his huge hand, which was several times bigger than before, and attempted to pull the heavenly ring staff from the purple crystal. However, he failed to remove it with his brute force. Actually, he couldn't put too much pressure on the staff because he was afraid that he might break it. Jeffrey then threw a few more punches at the purple crystal, where the lower part of the staff was buried. A few moments after, the crystal was finally smashed to pieces, allowing him to completely acquire the heavenly ring staff. As he stared upon the staff in his hands, he couldn't help but blurt out, "Does this thing really have the ability to reverse the grim situation that we're facing?" He inspected the staff some more and then injected a wisp of consciousness into it. As soon as it entered the staff, it just vanished without a trace. "It's useless, huh?" Jeffrey was quite surprised upon seeing it. After thinking for a while, he decided to grab the heavenly ring staff and walk towards the door. He saw that the little girl was still there and standing silently. Once the heavenly ring staff was taken away, the levitation tower had already served its purpose and would lose its meaning of existence. It also meant that the little girl would disappear over time, though no one knew how much time would elapse before that happened. "Hey, do you know how to use the heavenly ring staff?" Jeffrey thought of asking the little girl. But as usual, the little girl just shook her head and said, "I don't know." "TCH, you know nothing." However, Jeffrey's primary goal was only to take the heavenly ring staff to Zen. So, it wasn't really that urgent for him to find an answer on how to use it. "Then, how can I leave this place?" he asked again. This time, before the little girl could shake her head and tell him that she didn't know, a great force of attraction suddenly rushed out from the staff, extracting a small portion of power from Jeffrey's body. Whoosh, whoosh, A ray of purple light hovered around the heavenly ring staff and directly shot towards the ceiling of the levitation tower's top floor. The moment that the beam of purple light hit the ceiling, it suddenly transformed into something inconceivable. Earlier, when the different races of the deep space, which were at the bottom of the tower, had witnessed that the green light had climbed up to the top floor, they got restless. However, soon after, they saw that the green light suddenly disappeared. Normally, when this light was extinguished, it meant that the creature bearing it had died. Upon seeing this, most of the members of the deep space races let out loud cheers. They thought that if they couldn't get the heavenly ring staff, then they hoped that the elemental race couldn't obtain it either. However, among all these savage creatures, a small portion of them was actually disappointed. These creatures didn't want to die in the levitation tower. If someone was able to acquire the heavenly ring staff, then it meant that their cruel situation would be over. It had been a while since the green light was extinguished, and then a ray of purple light suddenly appeared. The top of the levitation tower, which originally looked like a chimney, began spreading out. It transformed into a flower-like object that bloomed and expanded in all directions. From it, a burly figure eventually emerged. Buzz. At this moment, Jeffrey noticed that all the lines on the huge square turned into green. He looked at the green lines and wondered if it meant that the restrictions on the square had been lifted already. While pondering on this thought, he jumped from the top of the tower. After floating in the air for a while, he accurately landed at the door of the oval-shaped building on the far right of the tower. At that time, the little monster from the elemental race was also standing at the door of the building. So, when Jeffrey suddenly landed, the monster was instantly stunned as Jeffrey appeared in front of him. For a brief moment, he was in a daze. When he came to his senses, the little monster muttered some indistinguishable words, then bent over and bowed before Jeffrey. "Hey, you don't need to do this." Jeffrey was slightly taken aback by the little monster's sudden actions. He couldn't help but think that these deep space races were indeed simple-minded. In fact, Elder Shui had persevered in teaching them a lot of things. However, they still held their beliefs and traditions that the primitive tribes followed. With that, Elder Shui had no choice but to disguise himself as their god, because this was the only way that he could properly and effectively command the elemental race. When the members of the different races from the deep space saw Jeffrey with the legendary staff in his hand, their stares immediately turned nasty. It was as if they were ready to pounce on him any time. When they found out that the restrictions on the huge square were already lifted, they rushed towards Jeffrey without any hesitation. They came from all directions while letting out wild screams and roars. Wah, wah, goo, 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 grr, grr, grr. They let out a series of roars, but Jeffrey couldn't understand a single word they were saying. He thought that Elder Shui was so amazing, because he was perhaps the only one who had grasped the languages of all the 6 large races in the deep space. While he couldn't comprehend the words that they were shouting, Jeffrey could roughly guess what was running in their minds and what they were trying to say. It must have been some nonsense like, "Hand over the heavenly ring staff, or we'll kill you." He was pretty sure of that because he could see it on their angry faces. Upon seeing this, the little monster uttered something and actually stood in front of Jeffrey with a dreadful look on his face. Even in front of all those creatures that were rushing towards them, he was hell-bent on protecting Jeffrey at all costs. However, while Jeffrey deeply appreciated the thought, he stretched out his huge hand, lifted the little monster, and put him aside. "Don't worry, a lot has changed since I entered the deep space. You don't need to protect me anymore." When Jeffrey obtained the soul power as a reward, he was extremely thrilled. Through that, he had attained a massive boost in his strength, but his physical body was still weak. Now, his physical body had become terrifyingly strong. With his every move, he could feel an enormous force surging from within his body. He actually couldn't wait to test out his newly acquired strength. Whoosh! Jeffrey then swiftly waved the heavenly ring staff and pointed it at the members of the deep space races. As the creatures continued dashing towards Jeffrey, the 3 cold apes were the first ones to launch their attacks through their agile movements. Although these creatures possessed low intelligence, their strength, bloodlust, and experience in battle couldn't be underestimated. Since they were natives of the deep space, it could be said that their physical talent was still far greater than that of the creatures of the main world and the chaos. However, strictly speaking, Jeffrey was now a member of the fostering race, not only an ordinary one, but actually a top master. Although the movements of the cold apes were too fast to be tracked by ordinary warriors, before Jeffrey's eyes, they were extremely slow. He lifted the heavenly ring staff, and rushed towards the cold apes. Crash! Boom! With a tremendous gap in speed and strength, Jeffrey didn't even need to use any special skill to bring down his opponents. The fight had ended even before the cold apes realized what had happened. They didn't know what hit them, but they just felt very dizzy as if their world was spinning furiously. They also felt a severe pain on their backs as if a massive force smashed them. Consequently, they immediately fell on the ground, unable to move even an inch. All of the other creatures who witnessed this immediately stopped on their tracks. The truth was Jeffrey even held back most of his strength in fear that he might damage the heavenly ring staff. If he didn't hold back, there was no way that these cold apes lying on the ground were still alive. I know you're not stupid enough to court death upon seeing what I could do, right? Jeffrey glared at the creatures in front of him as he said this. They might not understand what he exactly said, but he knew that through his actions, he was able to clearly relay his message. When every member of these races saw the pitiful state of the mighty cold apes, they eventually stepped back and lost their resolve to fight. Just from the look in Jeffrey's eyes, they could sense an intimidating aura that would crush them the moment that they dared to go against him. Let's go, we're finished here. Jeffrey turned around and threw the little monster on his back. With a huge leap, he instantly flew out of the square. After passing the periphery of the huge square, Jeffrey looked into the distance and discovered that he was currently at the center of the Skywheel City. Previously, the spiders had carried him from the underground space all the way up to the spiral stairs. Purr, purr, the little monster made some excited sounds as he pointed at a particular direction from Jeffrey's back. Although Jeffrey couldn't smoothly communicate with him, he kind of knew that he was pointing to the direction of the elemental race. After flying quite a distance towards the southwestern part of the Skywheel City, Jeffrey observed that there were huge chunks of strata floating in the sky, each of which was about 100 miles in diameter. He concluded that these giant strata must have been a part of a huge continent before. With the guidance from the little monster, Jeffrey flew towards one of the floating giant strata. However, even before he could get close, the little monster let out successive shrieks. Alarmed by the reaction of the little monster, Jeffrey looked around and quickly saw that there were black smoke pillars rising at the center of the massive stratum. Chapter 3837, The Crisis of the Elemental Race. Beneath the black pillars of smoke was a large city, the gathering place of the elemental race. Spots in the deep space such as this were constructed quite simply and crudely, keeping with the forms of a primitive tribe. Elder Shui had introduced some unique construction techniques to the elemental race and helped them build an exquisite city. However, it had been decimated. The deep space races present in the huge square had their ways of spreading news. In fact, they had already done so when the elemental race had climbed up to 200 feet in the levitation tower. They hoped Elder Shui would decipher the mysteries of the levitation tower, but also wanted all the information they could get from him. This made it very difficult for them to correctly choose their time of attack on the elemental race. As the deep space races hesitated, waiting for their opportunity, Elder Shui and Jeffrey entered the tower and reached a height of 200 feet. News of this mobilized them. No matter how unintelligent they were, they knew they would have to make a move as soon as possible. Before Jeffrey had gotten to the top of the levitation tower, the 5 races had already set off to attack the elemental race. At the center of the gathering place was a wooden pavilion with a narrow underground passage beneath it. In the innermost secret basement, sat the white-haired Elder Shui. Bang, bang, bang. A muffled sound could be heard from above. What is that noise? Elder Shui asked. He was still a 4th-grade creature in nature. Although he had been in the deep space for a long time, he was limited to his own life level, and his understanding and awareness of his surroundings was still very unrefined. He heard the huge muffled sound, but was unable to tell its direction. A man of the elemental race in a red robe said shakily, "Elder Shui. They are attacking the pavilion." Elder Shui sat motionless and murmured, "So soon?" Truthfully, he had a feeling this day would come when he planned to go to the levitation tower with Jeffrey. "Elder Shui, I'll get you out through the tunnel," yelled that man of the elemental race. Elder Shui had built a complicated system of tunnels below the ground to make it more convenient for the elemental race to escape. "All right," Elder Shui nodded. He was not afraid of death, but after the precious body had died, all his hopes rested on Jeffrey. No matter what, before he died, he wanted to know whether Jeffrey was capable of obtaining the heavenly ring staff. He refused to die before seeing Jeffrey again. The man carried Elder Shui on his back, pushed open the door of the secret room and made his way towards the other end of the passageway. He had only taken a couple steps when a long spear shot at him. Puff! Before he could react, he was impaled to the wall of the passageway and Elder Shui was thrown to the ground. Who was here? Elder Shui stood up with a wobble, trying to distinguish what lay before him. All he could make out were circles of various sizes. With a little bit more time he was able to slowly understand the meaning behind them. Not far away was a golden-haired cold ape who had lurked in from the other side of the passageway. The cold ape race has always regarded you as an esteemed guest. We're much better than these members of the elemental race. Why are you trying to escape, Elder Shui? Asked the golden-haired cold ape. Elder Shui pretended not to understand and made an attempt to leave. But the golden-haired cold ape sneered and lifted him up. With a slight snort, a layer of black light covered his body and he then took Elder Shui towards the ground above. Once he stood on the surface of the ground, he held Elder Shui and roared, "Everyone, stop!" The members of the elemental race continued struggling, giving all they had. They had been forced to retreat, yet they remained in high spirits. But seeing Elder Shui captured stunned them. The other races of the deep space frothed at the mouth in greed when they saw Elder Shui. The news that Jeffrey had reached the top of the levitation tower had not yet reached them. They just wanted the information about the levitation tower from Elder Shui. "We have nothing against the elemental race. As long as you are willing to tell us the secrets of the levitation tower, our 5 races will leave, okay?" said the golden-haired cold ape menacingly. "The Rona race agrees. So do we, I agree." Each race echoed the last. The cold ape placed Elder Shui in front of him and said one word at a time, "I know you know our language. Do not pretend you don't. If you don't tell us what we want to know, we will kill the entire elemental race." This was a seriously deadly threat. Elder Shui had established and developed a deep relationship with the elemental race. It was not that he was unwilling to reveal anything about the levitation tower, but by the rules of the tower, these wild races were unqualified to reach a height of 200 feet in it. He hesitated for a moment and the golden-haired cold ape ran a finger across his own neck, gesturing the cutting of a throat. "Kill them all." They were about to resume the slaughter. "Wait." Elder Shui called out. He then said, in a language he was clearly unskilled in, "After reaching 200 feet of the levitation tower, you only need to answer some questions." All he could do was to tell the truth. But he knew that once he told them what he knew, he and those of the elemental race would be killed. As he spoke, he tried formulating a plan to get out of this situation. In all his years, he had never encountered such passivity among so many enemies. After all, these deep space races also had gripes and issues with each other and would not join hands to attack the elemental race. He genuinely had no way to deal with his current predicament. He was in despair and had almost lost all hope when he suddenly felt a powerful wave. If Elder Shui could feel the energy, these deep space races could feel it much clearer. They sensed a powerful wave of energy coming from the sky. By the time they saw it clearly, it was only 100 feet away from the golden-haired cold ape. The golden-haired cold ape sensed that something was wrong and was about to run, but it was too late. Boom! Jeffrey's burly body plummeted like a mountain, smashing the golden-haired cold ape into the soil. Everything else in Elder Shui's eyes were made up of rings, but he saw Jeffrey as clear as day. A huge sense of relief washed over him when he saw Jeffrey and the heavenly ring staff in his hand. What are you doing here? You should go back to the chaos to find Master Kincaid." "I can't find a way back," Jeffrey said with a smile. "But it's too dangerous here. You shouldn't have come," insisted Elder Shui. "That's not an issue," Jeffrey bellowed with a confident grin. He grabbed the heavenly ring staff and slammed it into the ground twice. His own power began to drain rapidly and was absorbed by the heavenly ring staff. He had discovered this ability of the heavenly ring staff when he was at the top of the levitation tower. The staff needed to absorb power to be a help to him. The staff had taken a lot of his power this time. His limbs felt weak and the heavenly ring staff then released an intense pressure that swept through almost everything. The members of the elemental race and the other races then felt as if their legs had been filled with lead. They all collapsed face first into the ground, unable to get up again. Chapter 3838, Return. Jeffrey had the physique and soul of a powerful warrior, but his theurgy was still limited to the godly ways of the chaos. He had never mastered the power of the main world and the deep space. He had no idea what kind of theurgy the heavenly ring staff possessed. He was shocked to see everyone around him get knocked to the floor by the strong force it was emanating. "Stop, let the members of the elemental race go," Jeffrey sputtered. At this, the heavenly ring staff trembled slightly. The members of the elemental race who had been brought to the floor felt the pressure ease off them. They quickly scrambled to get back up. As soon as they were back on their feet, they swarmed around Jeffrey and Elder Shui. They knelt in front of them and bowed again and again in reverence. They considered Elder Shui as a sage and a god to be venerated. It was a kind of blasphemy for the golden-haired cold apes to have held him hostage. But Jeffrey defeated those heretics, so he must be a stronger sage and a more powerful god than Elder Shui himself. Jeffrey shifted uncomfortably, watching the people kowtow to him. Elder Shui, please tell them not to bow and scrape like that. It makes me feel so bad. Elder Shui smiled helplessly. I can't. The elemental race is still a primitive race. Faith is quite important to them. I can help them keep the faith, but snapping them out of it is another matter entirely. Elder Shui then turned and said something to the elemental race. As one, they got up and began charging at the outsiders. The members of the elemental race showed no mercy to those who had attacked Elder Shui. They slaughtered them all. The area was left awash in blood. 4 hours later, in an exquisite wooden hall, Jeffrey began to discuss returning back home with Elder Shui. Jeffrey actually knew the way back, but he had come here to send the little monster home and try to bring Elder Shui back. However, Elder Shui only shook his head at his proposition. I'm afraid that's not possible. Why? Jeffrey asked, puzzled. Elder Shui looked surprised. Don't you know, after the catastrophe with the Four Spirit sect, no one from the main world could return. If they do, they will die. This was also the case in the deep space. In the decisive battle between the fostering race and the cinnabar race, some members had managed to escape. It was unknown whether they were still alive, but rules had been imposed then that they would never be able to return. That was why when Kincaid in the Chaos heard that the Grand Supreme Elderly Lord had seen Elder Shui, he had correctly estimated that Elder Shui was still living in the deep space. He couldn't have broken the restriction. It would have been impossible for him to cross the main world and then go straight to the Chaos. So I'm really going back alone? A disappointed Jeffrey said. Yes, the top priority is to bring back the Heavenly Ring staff. The sooner, the better, Elder Shui said firmly. But those races in the deep space will definitely seek revenge on you. You might be in danger, Elder Shui, Jeffrey pleaded. Elder Shui smiled. You have the Heavenly Ring staff. It's strong enough to control the life and death of all the inhabitants in the deep space. They couldn't take revenge on me if they try. He knew Elder Shui was probably right, but Jeffrey still couldn't help but feel uneasy. He turned to speak to the Heavenly Ring staff. I need some guards to protect him. The Heavenly Ring staff extracted Jeffrey's power again. Rumble. The ground trembled and splintered. Over 1,000 human-shaped statues crawled out. Jeffrey nodded in approval at these guards created by the Heavenly Ring staff. Witnessing what looked like a miracle to them, the members of the elemental race began to fall all over themselves to praise Jeffrey again. It wasn't long before Jeffrey had to bid goodbye and start his journey back. He left the broken ground and returned to the Sky Wheel City. From the center of the city, he went northward to the most remote point. He passed the passageway and made his way back to the secret circular room he had come from before. He activated the transmission array here. The beams of light started shooting into his body, engulfing him bit by bit from head to foot. His body began to disappear in parts until it completely vanished from the spot. In the next moment, Jeffrey found himself in the diamond-shaped array above the eternal divine courtyard. He gathered his bearings momentarily, looked around, and then jumped down. Whoosh! It had taken Jeffrey several months to climb up the pillar, but now that he could fly with the help of the Heavenly Ring staff, his descent was much quicker. He had left Zia at the foot of the pillar, so he went to meet him first. Whoosh! When Jeffrey was 100 feet high above the ground, he turned and flew toward the nearest secondary world. At that moment in the secondary world, Zia was hard at work piecing together a statue. It had been such a long time since Jeffrey had left, and he had yet to hear from him. He couldn't help but fear he had met a terrible fate. But Zia never gave up easily. He had once been exiled into the deleting space, but even then, he had remained steadfast. In the end, he had not only successfully controlled the deleting space, but had also drilled a hole right through the chaos. He refused to leave the secondary world without Jeffrey. After all, without him, he wouldn't have even been able to climb up the pillar, let alone go back to the deleting space. He focused his attention on the statue he was working on. The statue made by the Four Spirits sect could freely walk around the abstruse energy world. He thought if he could control it, perhaps he could leave bit by bit. However, he soon found that the way the Four Spirits sect created the statue was quite complex. It took Zia a long time to repair even a small broken part of it. It occurred to him it would probably take him dozens of years to finish repairing it. But if he had been able to survive many chaotic eras in the deleting space, a few decades here were nothing. Swoosh! The sound broke into Zia's reveries. He snapped his head up and saw a figure flying in. It was Jeffrey carrying a wooden staff. Zia let out a series of expletives and burst into laughter. He had lived for over 1,000 chaotic eras, but he was still as exuberant as before. Master Zia, I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, Jeffrey greeted with a smile. What took you so long? I was beginning to think you had died. Were you able to reach the top of the pillar? Zia asked. He had been isolated here for some time and so knew nothing about what happened in the chaos. I did, but, Jeffrey began, did you find anything there? Zia pressed on eagerly. He knew how valuable the other short tokens at the top of the pillar were. Yes, I have, but, Jeffrey said slowly. But what? Zia asked. Jeffrey let out a deep breath. It's not what you might expect. A lot of things have happened. Chapter 3839, Meeting. Zia was obviously confused. What do you mean by, a lot of things? Can you please explain to me what happened? It was a long story. Jeffrey thought for a moment. Ultimately, he said, my father brought those human heroes to the Jade Pure Realm. Naturally, Zia was taken aback. What, they attacked the Element Spirit Civilization? No, actually, they fought some people who were even stronger than the whole Element Spirit Civilization. Afterward, Jeffrey told Zia everything he knew about what had happened in the Three Purities stage. So what you're saying is, my master. He is dead. Zia was thoroughly stunned by this news. It was like a wave of sadness suddenly washed over him. Jeffrey looked somber. Yes, I've heard that the primeval Lord of Heaven and the others died. However, they left their souls behind. Well, then what do we do now? Moreover, what's happened to you? Zia asked as he stared at Jeffrey. At that moment, Jeffrey's body had already expanded several times. Somehow, it made him look like a small giant. He emitted such a powerful and mysterious aura that it made Zia a little scared. Even with Zia's broad knowledge, it was still difficult for him to imagine what Jeffrey had experienced. Now, this is actually related to the task assigned to me by the Human Spirit King. He asked me to go to the deep space. So, Jeffrey told Zia that he had explored the pillar. He went into the deep space to fetch the heavenly ring staff. He proceeded to inform Zia about the details of the matter. It alleviated Zia's grief a little. At the same time, he also realized that the wooden staff in Jeffrey's hand was an extraordinary magical object. You said that the heavenly ring staff is omnipotent, right? Can you transform me into a creature of the abstruse energy world? Zia just had to ask if this was possible. Even though he studied the abstruse energy world for a long time, Zia had never been able to fully explore it. Well, we'll see. Let's give it a try, shall we? Maybe the heavenly ring staff can perform the soul reincarnation. The levitation tower was capable of releasing the soul reincarnation. Thus, the heavenly ring staff might be able to do the same. What is the soul reincarnation? This greatly piqued Zia's curiosity. With that, a smile appeared on Jeffrey's face. You'll know soon, trust me. Soon enough, he felt like the heavenly ring staff was drawing his strength. All of a sudden, they heard a splashing sound. It released an invisible force to envelop Zia. The next moment, Zia was feeling sharp pain all over his body. It began to expand infinitely. The pain was almost unbearable. Truth be told, Jeffrey was worried about Zia. He thought that maybe he wouldn't be able to tolerate the pain. After all, the soul reincarnation was pretty risky. On second thought, Zia was much stronger than those savage races in the deep space even though he was a creature of the third-grade world. It shouldn't be difficult for him to undergo one soul reincarnation. The pain lasted for quite some time. Slowly, Zia opened his eyes. He was in the secondary world. Therefore, he didn't notice any difference. Wait, what is this? Did it really have to hurt like that? Zia asked as he tried to move his body. Just follow me, Jeffrey replied with a smile on his face. He was right that Zia could tolerate the process. When he saw Jeffrey walking out of the secondary world, he immediately picked up the rope on the ground. He was afraid to get lost in the abstruse energy world. Just as he stepped into the abstruse energy world, the dots of light everywhere suddenly disappeared. They were replaced by an open, complete, and huge world. So this is what the soul reincarnation is. Yes, it helped you become a creature of the abstruse energy world. If your soul is strong enough, you can even become a creature of the deep space, Jeffrey responded. Naturally, Zia was quite ecstatic now. After all, he had studied this world for countless eras. And now, he could finally move freely in it. He was like a child who just learned how to run freely. If he had enough time, Zia was more than willing to stay in the abstruse energy world for a longer period of time. However, Jeffrey said that the situation in the chaos was very critical. They couldn't waste a single moment in the abstruse energy world. Meanwhile, a lot of things were also happening in the chaos. In the Pear Hill, Elizabeth of the Sun Crow race looked rather bored. She had been staring at the distant blood-colored sky for quite some time now. She had successfully guided Pompeo in taking over the blooming jade stage. Since then, she had rarely left the other shore. It was very interesting for her to manage the blooming jade stage. After all, she was a predominating ruler there. No one dared to disobey her. So this made her feel like she once did when she was the head of the divine lair. However, she didn't expect that disaster would strike so suddenly. Those destructive energy balls could devour everything. Elizabeth was able to escape the other shore to avoid the catastrophe. Unfortunately, Pompeo was not. This giant creature from the fourth grade world could only watch the energy balls raining down. As soon as Elizabeth returned to the blooming jade stage, she saw a huge crater. More than half of the blooming jade stage had been devoured. Even the core of the heavenly obsession civilization had been destroyed. She didn't have any choice. She couldn't stay on the other shore. Therefore, she decided to return to the Pear Hill and just watch the primitive land expand rapidly and grow even stronger. The primitive land expanded really fast. It exceeded everyone's expectations. Even Zen didn't foresee that it would develop this quickly. The larger the size of the primitive land was, the faster it would devour the heads. Its expansion speed increased exponentially. Compared to the primitive land, the once enormous Pear Hill was like a lonely sailboat on the vast ocean. Meanwhile, Zen was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed on the jadeite platform. He was trying to assess the chaos from the perspective of the primitive land. The source world is not getting any closer. It's actually beginning to move towards the exact opposite direction, Zen stated. His eyes remained closed. When they heard this news, Fuxi, the snake goddess, and the chaos ancient gods felt thoroughly relieved. A few days ago, the source world suddenly appeared. Naturally, it made everyone nervous. They knew the evil god too well. He was much too difficult to deal with. If he decided to target them, they would undoubtedly encounter a huge trouble. They would be seriously injured, if not dead. The primitive land was not how it used to be. It had expanded even larger than the developed source world. Nevertheless, this was not the right time to fight. Everyone was starting to relax when Zen continued. The source world released a flying ship. The flying ship was the size of a grain of sand compared to the current source world. Yet, Zen's keen eyes noticed it immediately. What? A flying ship? The snake goddess looked at Zen. Allow me to intercept it, said Fuxi. We can never let the evil god step foot on the primitive land. Otherwise, we will have a huge problem. Fuxi, the snake goddess, Kendrick, and Gerald wanted to make a move. However, Zen shook his head. You don't need to do anything. My incarnation can now leave the primitive land by will. I'll be the one to go, he said. It didn't matter what the evil god was planning to do. At most, Zen would only lose an incarnation. This was the safest plan. Realizing that, Fuxi, the snake goddess, and the others no longer insisted. After they settled on the plan, Zen summoned an incarnation to appear on the Pear Hill. The next moment, his incarnation appeared outside the primitive land on a flying ship. It merely floated in the empty chaos. The distance between the source world and the primitive land seemed really close. But in reality, they were quite far away from each other. It would take the two flying ships 2 days of traveling at a great speed before they met. But still, they were slowly getting closer. Zen stood on the flying ship and peered into the other one. The enchanted barrier at the top of the ship opened, and a black figure shot out of it and floated in the void. He looked at Zen and laughed wildly. It was none other than the evil god. Chapter 3840, Stasis Extreme Form. Zen just kept quiet as he waited for the evil god to finish his shrilling laughter. I'm really happy that you're still alive, the evil god said as he looked at Zen's huge primitive land in the distance. You have such a huge primitive land, huh? Is that the world where I used to live? Yes, Zen replied with a nod. Are my children still there? The evil god asked casually. Yes, they're still top masters of that continent, Zen answered. When the evil god heard this, a strange smile suddenly appeared on his face. So, are you planning to use them to threaten me? Zen frowned and scoffed slightly. You know what kind of person I am. Furthermore, I know your nature. I wouldn't waste my time doing such meaningless things. Just tell me what you want to do. Of course, Zen wouldn't even think of doing such a detestable thing. He also knew that with the twisted personality of the evil god, even if he used the important people in the life of the evil god to threaten him, it wouldn't affect him at all. Ha ha, so straightforward. The evil god laughed awkwardly and pointed downwards. Down there, that's where our common enemy is. He was actually pointing towards the vast chaos. Without the chaos clouds covering the area, it was just an empty space. Occasionally, there would be some heads wandering around that must have escaped from being devoured. Common enemy, who are you talking about? Zen was quite confused with the evil god's statement. Who? The snake spirit king and the downgrader behind him, of course, the evil god replied with a grin. They have created an immense primitive land that looks like a huge pyramid. Currently, it is already bigger than mine, and of course, much bigger than yours. Generally speaking, the process of the primitive lands in devouring the heads could be likened to rolling a snowball. Originally, the source world should have the most advantage, because it had the largest size. Thus, its efficiency in devouring the heads was far greater than the other two competitors. However, the evil god was so late in understanding the meaning of the downgrade and also didn't know how to deal with the overwhelming heads that suddenly appeared in the source world. In fact, before he came up with a solution, a lot of parts of the source world were already devoured by them. When the evil god had finished dealing with the trouble in the source world, Zen's primitive land and the pyramid-like primitive land had already caught up in terms of size. Thus, even though the source world was originally the largest, it was now left behind. The huge pyramid, Zen stared at the void with a worried expression in his eyes. Now, if you want to deal with it, I suggest that we better join hands. It'll be easier that way, the evil god recommended. Previously, when Zen led the monkey spirit sect to the Jade Pure Realm, he deemed it necessary to form a temporary alliance with the bird spirit sect. In this current situation, it seemed reasonable for him to join hands with the evil god who controlled the source world, but he was quite hesitant. He thought that the evil god was much harder to deal with than the bird masters. So, he couldn't help but smirk and ask, join hands. How are we going to do that? We join our forces. We will integrate your primitive land with my source world, the evil god said indifferently. Zen was again quite baffled with what the evil god said. Can primitive lands merge together? Yes, it's simple. We'll just let my source world devour your primitive land, the evil god said it like it was common knowledge. Why do you think I should agree to that? Zen's expression started to become serious. At the back of his mind, he kind of knew that it was how it was done, but a trace of anger still surfaced from his heart. As the evil god noticed Zen's faint anger, a condescending smile appeared on his face. Isn't it obvious? It's because I'm stronger than you. Oh, what makes you think so? Zen's eyebrow slightly raised as his expression became colder. Well, we can test it out if you want, the evil god continued to provoke Zen with a sinister smile. Without waiting for Zen's response, he suddenly bent a finger and a colorful light flashed from his fingertip. It turned out to be the Way's blending energy. As the evil god gently flicked his finger, the ray of light swiftly shot towards Zen's head. Facing the sudden attack, Zen wasn't fazed at all. Just before the ray of light hit him, his body became blurry and completely disappeared. The colorful light that missed its target hit the flying ship from afar and instantly turned into a dazzling white energy ball. The entire ship was annihilated, and not a piece of debris could be found. The evil god didn't even need to use his eyes when he fought. With a wave of his hands, a long whip formed from the Way's blending energy spread out from his fingers and lashed violently at the void. At the same time, Zen's figure kept moving in the space. After dodging several attacks from the whip, he seized the right chance and grabbed it with his bare hand. Explode! The evil god shouted. The long whip instantly turned into a blazing white ball of light and enveloped Zen. However, before the ball of light continued to expand, it suddenly shrank at an incredible rate and fully dissipated. As Zen's image emerged, he said, although the Way's blending energy is strong, it is still the power of a third-grade world. This is your innate limitation. Ha, are you sure about that? The evil god showed a defiant grin and quickly dashed towards Zen. He raised his hand and suddenly brandished a long whip again. However, this time, the whip was not formed through the Way's blending energy, but by three energies that emanated green, black, and red lights. Zen calmly grasped the end of the whip again and analyzed the energies that were flowing in it. But as soon as he realized the source of the energies, the corners of his eyes twitched slightly. These energies, they are bloodline powers. They are from the fourth-grade world. And there are actually 19 kinds of them. Dealing with 19 kinds of bloodline powers was still actually a piece of cake for Zen, but he was still surprised that the evil god could actually handle and master them. After Zen analyzed it, a faint yellow energy surfaced from his fingers. The yellow energy wrapped around the tricolored whip, like a spider web, and rapidly disintegrated it. The evil god didn't just stand idly. He then waved his hand, releasing a surge of brown ripples from his palm. As the brown ripples came in contact with the yellow energy, they instantly devoured the energy until not a single trace was left. Upon seeing the capability of the brown ripples, Zen was actually shocked. It was not that big of a deal to use several kinds of bloodline powers simultaneously. However, the difficult thing to do was to quickly analyze the bloodline powers contained in a weapon or skill and then find out the corresponding energy that could restrain them. Originally, Zen thought that he was the only one who could do that. If the evil god could also do the same, he started to think if the evil god had also mastered all the bloodline powers. Buzz, buzz, buzz. As the brown ripples were hurled directly towards Zen, he pointed his finger at them, unleashing thin bolts of lightning that instantly disintegrated the brown ripples. These bolts of lightning also charged towards the evil god at an astonishing speed. The two of them released all kinds of blood powers to restrain each other. They exchanged blows and skillfully countered everything that was thrown against both sides. After several rounds, the evil god got a little bored because no one was getting the upper hand. You're right, the innate limitation is the most horrible thing. So, I've been studying how to break out of it. Yes, 373 bloodline powers are undoubtedly strong, but it's still not enough. Upon saying that, he drew a circle in the air using his other hand, and a white hexagonal snowflake emerged from the circle. After its formation, the evil god knocked on the hexagonal snowflake. Crack, just with that gentle knock, the snowflake shattered. Soon after, every part of it dissipated in the air. Seeing this, Zen couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was about to happen. The next moment, the figure of the evil god also disappeared, but his voice could still be heard. If I want to, I can kill you 1,000 times or even 10,000 times. I can put you in an illusion that time is frozen. Unfortunately, you won't comprehend the beauty of this state. You'll only feel bemused. How pitiful you are. Zen felt a little weird as he heard that the sentences of the evil god were overlapping. It was as if he was speaking them at the same time. When he finished speaking, the evil god suddenly appeared in front of Zen, and also behind him, and even at both his sides. Then, the evil god stopped about 1 foot away from him, and said, "This is the stasis extreme form.